Close your eyes for a moment and picture a little New England village at the edge of the wilderness. The year is late in the 1600s. Snow drifts against the corners of clapboard houses, wood smoke curls into the gray sky, and the silence of winter is broken only by the occasional crack of an axe or the bark of a restless dog. This is Salem Village, an outpost that feels both stubbornly human and achingly fragile, balanced on the edge of a continent it has barely begun to tame. It wasn't the Salem of postcards or reenactments. It wasn't quaint or cozy. Life here was raw. Mud in spring, dust in summer, ice in winter. Families carved out farms from rocky soil, argued over whose fence was 6 inches too far left, and prayed desperately that their children would live past infancy. There was no sense of permanence, no cushion against disaster. A failed harvest, a sudden illness, a harsh storm, all of these could spell catastrophe. And when the people of Salem looked for explanations, they didn't think of germs or climate patterns. They thought of sin. They thought of Satan. The settlers of Salem were Puritans, and that matters more than anything else in this story. Puritans lived with a worldview as tight as a noose. God was everywhere, Satan was real, and every person was either marching toward salvation or slipping toward damnation. They were deeply suspicious of pleasure, endlessly focused on discipline, and utterly convinced that unseen spiritual forces shaped their everyday lives. That meant life was never just life. A sick child wasn't just a medical problem, it was a spiritual test. A cow that stopped giving milk wasn't just an unlucky farmer's misfortune, it could be evidence of a neighbor's curse. The line between the natural and the supernatural was so thin it almost didn't exist. And here's the thing, this belief wasn't strange to them. It was the air they breathed. Ministers thundered warnings from the pulpit. Parents scolded their children with scripture. Neighbors eyed each other warily, half afraid of sin, half afraid of scandal. To them, it was common sense. The devil wanted to destroy their godly community, and he would use whatever means he could. Now, you might imagine that a community so devout would at least be united. But Salem Village was divided almost from the moment it was founded. Part of the problem was geography. Just a few miles away was Salem Town, a wealthy port full of merchants, sailors, and trade. Salem Village, by contrast, was made up of struggling farmers who often felt overshadowed, exploited, or simply ignored by their wealthier neighbors. Even within the village, there were factions. Some families leaned toward the town eager for trade, prosperity, and looser ties to the rigid village church. Others clung to the old ways, determined to remain a separate, God-fearing settlement. These divisions weren't just abstract. They were personal. They played out in disputes over land, inheritance, and the appointment of ministers. Old grudges piled up like dry tinder. So when something unusual happened, say, strange fits in the minister's household, it wasn't just about religion. It was about which side you were on, which family you supported, and how much you trusted your neighbor. At the center of Salem Village stood its parsonage, home to Reverend Samuel Parris. He wasn't a man who inspired warm loyalty. He was stern, quick-tempered, and often more concerned with his salary and property than with pastoral care. Some respected him as a strong leader, others muttered that he was greedy and divisive. But in a Puritan community, the minister mattered more than anyone else. He was the voice of God, the guardian of souls, the one who interpreted every drought, every sickness, every misfortune. If his house was in disorder, then the whole village felt vulnerable. And that house was full of pressure. Inside lived Parris's 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams. Also under his roof was Tituba, a woman enslaved and brought from the Caribbean, whose very presence added a layer of tension and mystery. Parris expected order, obedience, and godliness from his household. What he got instead, in the long dark of winter, was something that defied explanation. You have to understand the role of whispers in a place like Salem. This was a society where gossip wasn't just idle chatter, it was a form of evidence. People kept mental ledgers of their neighbors' behavior. Who skipped church? Who quarreled too much? Who seemed just a little too different? If a child fell sick, you remembered the widow who muttered under her breath at the meeting house. If a cow died, You were called the neighbor who never returned your borrowed pot. The smallest oddity could spiral into suspicion. And because Puritans believed the devil worked through ordinary people, suspicion was never just about character, it was about cosmic battle. So when people began to notice strange behavior in Reverend Parris's house, they didn't dismiss it as childish play or illness. They leaned closer. They whispered. And each whisper carried weight. The months leading up to the outbreak of the trials were brutal. Snow fell deep, food stores ran low, and illness crept through households. People were restless, hungry, and scared. When survival is in question, explanations matter even more. Why had God sent such hardship? Was he angry with them? Were there hidden sins in the village that needed rooting out? Ministers warned that Satan prowled New England, seeking to destroy the faithful. And in the bleak midwinter, such warnings didn't feel like abstractions. They felt like answers. It started with the children. Betty and Abigail began acting strangely, crying out, falling into fits, contorting their bodies, and saying things that terrified the adults around them. At first, it might have looked like childish antics. But when the fits grew worse, when the girls screamed that invisible hands were pinching or choking them, when their behavior couldn't be calmed or explained, the whispers sharpened into something darker. The minister's house, the very center of Salem's spiritual life, seemed under attack. And if Satan could reach into the parsonage itself, then surely no one in the village was safe. Looking back now, it's tempting to think Salem was uniquely foolish, but that's unfair. Across Europe, witch hunts had taken thousands of lives in the century before. The belief that witches were real, dangerous, and allied with the devil wasn't some fringe superstition. It was mainstream. It was law. What made Salem unique was timing. The community was already fractured, already stressed by war on the frontier, by crop failures, by poverty, and by feuds that went back decades. The soil was dry. All it needed was a spark. And that spark began with whispers. Whispers in kitchens, in barns, in pews. Whispers that maybe the devil had crept into Salem Village. Whispers that maybe he wore the face of someone they already knew. No one shouted witchcraft at first. It was too dangerous, too heavy a charge. But the whispers built momentum. They fed on each other. When one person hinted at suspicion, another confirmed it with a story of their own. Each tale added fuel until silence was no longer an option. And when Reverend Parris himself began to suspect that his household was under a spiritual assault, the whispers became accusations. The line was crossed. Salem Village was no longer just fearful, it was convinced. So here's where we leave Salem Village at the dawn of its nightmare, a divided community, bristling with tension, hardened by winter, obsessed with spiritual warfare, and now shaken by the unexplainable behavior of its minister's daughter and niece. The whispers had begun. They would soon become cries. And those cries would echo across the village, across Massachusetts, and across history. When the children of Salem Village began thrashing and shrieking, their neighbors didn't reach first for a medical explanation. They reached for something older, something rooted in centuries of tradition and fear. The devil. To understand why Salem's people responded the way they did, we need to step back and see the larger story, the long shadow of witchcraft that stretched across oceans and centuries, right into the cold heart of New England. The idea of witches was hardly new in the 1690s. Europe had been in the grip of witch hunts for generations. From the Black Forest of Germany to the windswept moors of Scotland, courts had tried, tortured, and executed tens of thousands of supposed witches. Some towns burned dozens in a single day. Pamphlets circulated with gruesome accounts of women flying on broomsticks, making pacts with the devil, or poisoning livestock with a whispered curse. Most of these beliefs came from a blend of folklore and religion. Medieval Europe was filled with stories of night-riding hags, changelings, and sorcery. When the Protestant Reformation swept across the continent, it only intensified the obsession with rooting out spiritual corruption. Catholic priests and Protestant ministers alike warned their flocks that Satan was cunning, patient, and relentless. And what was a witch but one of his foot soldiers? By the time the Puritans crossed the Atlantic, these ideas were deeply embedded. They carried them in their sermons, in their Bibles, in their imaginations. Witchcraft wasn't a superstition to be mocked, it was a crime, a sin, and a threat to the very fabric of a godly community. For Puritans, Satan was not some vague symbol of evil. He was real, tangible, a creature who prowled about, whispering lies, tempting souls, and unleashing chaos. And unlike some earlier Christians who thought the devil was mostly active in distant lands or in pagan temples, Puritans believed he was right here, in the New World, working tirelessly to destroy their fragile outposts of faith. Think about it. They had fled England to create a city upon a hill, a shining example of godliness in a wilderness filled with danger. If they failed, it wasn't just their lives at stake, it was the experiment itself, the hope of building a society rooted in Scripture. No wonder they saw themselves as besieged. Every crop failure, every Indian raid on the frontier, every outbreak of disease was interpreted as part of Satan's war against them. And witches, in this worldview, weren't just eccentric old women muttering to themselves. They were collaborators with the enemy, traitors in a holy war. Salem wasn't the first New England community to grapple with witchcraft. As early as the 1640s, courts in Massachusetts had tried and executed women accused of the crime. In 1647, Alce Young of Windsor, Connecticut, became the first recorded execution for witchcraft in the American colonies. Others followed, small waves of panic, quickly quelled but never forgotten. Villagers told stories of bewitched butter that wouldn't churn, of livestock struck dead without reason, of sudden illnesses that no doctor could cure. Ministers thundered against witches from pulpits, reminding their congregations that the Bible itself commanded, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Each generation grew up hearing these stories. By the time the children of Salem began their fits, the idea of witchcraft wasn't outlandish. It was familiar. It was part of the landscape, like the forests that pressed against the edge of every farm. Daily life in New England was full of small superstitions, many of them carried from England. People whispered about the evil eye, about charms and counter-charms, about dreams that foretold disaster. Even Puritans, who condemned such things as pagan nonsense, often lived as if they were true. If a woman's butter wouldn't come, she might quietly suspect her neighbor had bewitched the churn. If a hunter's gun misfired again and again, he might mumble about curses. In an age before germ theory or modern science, these explanations made sense. When you live in a world where survival is precarious, it's natural to reach for meaning, even if it means blaming the unseen. And then there was the wilderness. To modern eyes, the forests of Massachusetts might look beautiful, towering pines, rivers cutting through valleys, crisp, clean air. But to the Puritans, those forests were menacing. They were home to native tribes who resisted English expansion, to wolves that howled at night, and to the unknown. Ministers preached that the devil lurked in the wild places, waiting to strike. Some even believed the New World itself was Satan's territory, a dark land being contested by God's chosen people. That belief made every unexplained event more sinister. If the devil lived in the woods, why wouldn't he also send his agents into the village? Puritan ministers didn't shy away from talking about witchcraft. On the contrary, they leaned into it. Sermons about Satan's tricks were common. Cotton Mather, one of New England's most famous ministers, would later publish a book on the Salem trials called Wonders of the Invisible World. But even before that, he and others spoke constantly about the dangers of invisible forces. For villagers, hearing week after week that witches were real, that the devil was active, and that only vigilance could save them, it became impossible not to see witchcraft everywhere. It was the background music of their lives, always playing, always reminding them to be wary. By the time Betty Paris and Abigail Williams began their strange behavior, Salem was already primed to believe. The soil had been prepared for years, watered with stories from Europe, fertilized with New England's own witch trials, and nourished by sermons from the pulpit. The idea that witches might be active in the village wasn't shocking, it was expected. That's why the whispers of Salem Village caught fire so quickly. People weren't scrambling to invent a new explanation. They were plugging what they saw into a belief system that had been reinforced for decades. So when neighbors began to gather outside Reverend Parris's house, watching the children cry out in torment, they weren't starting from zero. They already had the answer in their minds. The devil was here. The only question was, through whom? That question, simple, terrible, and irresistible, was the spark that would ignite the Salem Witch Trials. The devil in New England wasn't a rumor. He was a fact of life, woven into the fabric of belief, culture, and fear. When the crisis came to Salem, it was less an explosion out of nowhere and more the eruption of a long-simmering volcano. The villagers didn't ask whether witchcraft was real. They asked who was guilty. And that question would soon unravel their entire community. The winter was the kind that grinds people down to the bone. Snow piled against the houses until it nearly reached the windows. Smoke hung heavy in the air as families burned wood constantly, trying to keep the frost from creeping too far into their walls. Salem Village was already a hard place to live, but in the winter before the witch panic began, it seemed even harsher. People were tired, supplies were low, and disputes that might have been shrugged off in warmer months suddenly felt like matters of life and death. Inside homes, food stores shrank quickly. Root cellars held only so many potatoes and turnips, barrels of salted fish were rationed carefully, and anything fresh was long gone. Meals became repetitive and thin. Hunger gnawed at families, and even if no one was outright starving, the weariness of eating the same meager portions every day weighed on them. Children grew restless. Parents grew irritable. In an age before central heating, every chore was a battle with the cold. To step outside meant facing bitter winds that cut like knives. To stay inside meant being cramped with relatives, tensions simmering. It wasn't just the weather. There was the ever-present threat of illness. Colds that lingered too long could turn deadly. Fevers swept through households without explanation. Mothers rocked sick children by the fire, praying over them while fathers went about their chores grim-faced, knowing prayer might not be enough. When disease struck, it didn't just take lives, it made people question why. Why this child? Why this family? Was it God's judgment? Was it sin? Or was it something far more sinister? This was the soil in which suspicion thrived. When everything feels precarious, your food, your health, your survival, it doesn't take much for fear to bloom. Add in the disputes Salem Village was already known for, and the winter became more than just a season. It was a pressure cooker. Neighbors carried grudges like hot coals, ready to scorch when given the chance. Land disputes dragged on endlessly. Families fought over inheritance. Arguments about boundaries or property lines turned personal and bitter. Even within households, there was strain. Long nights meant long hours for quarrels to flare. Children grew bored and invented games, some of which, like fortune-telling or little superstitions, were strictly forbidden by Puritan rules. But when you're stuck in a house with nothing to do, rules start to bend. In Reverend Parris's parsonage, the stress of winter pressed harder than most. He was already a divisive figure, criticized for his harshness and his fixation on money. Some thought he was too demanding, too quick to see enemies in his congregation. And yet, for all that, his home was supposed to be a model of order. But that winter, it wasn't. 9-year-old Betty Parris and her cousin Abigail Williams, just a couple of years older, began to show signs of something strange. They would scream without warning, fall into fits, twist their bodies in ways that terrified their parents. They claimed invisible hands pinched and clawed them. They barked like dogs, threw things across the room, and seemed utterly beyond control. In a world with no understanding of epilepsy or psychological illness, what could this possibly be? At first, people tried to find ordinary explanations. Maybe it was some kind of sickness, a fever that rattled the brain. Maybe it was childish mischief, a desperate attempt to win attention during the long, dull nights. But when the episodes continued and grew worse, those explanations began to feel thin. And when doctors came and admitted they had no cure, the last fragile hope of a natural answer crumbled. That's when the whispers began to harden. If there was no earthly reason, perhaps there was a spiritual one. The idea of witchcraft was never far from anyone's mind, it hung in the air like smoke. The devil was always near, according to their ministers, seeking to corrupt the faithful. And if even the minister's household wasn't safe, then surely the devil had made his move. It's easy to imagine the scene, neighbors gathering in the Paris home, eyes wide as they watched the children scream and writhe, their words full of fear and awe. People muttered to each other in hushed tones. Some crossed themselves under their breath. Others looked around nervously, half expecting something to leap out of the shadows. Nobody said the word outright at first, but everyone was thinking it. Witchcraft. The cold outside pressed in, but the real chill came from within. If Satan's hand had touched Betty and Abigail, then who had he used to reach them? Someone nearby. Someone familiar. The thought sank into every mind, and it festered there. The harshness of the winter didn't just weaken bodies, it weakened trust. People looked at their neighbors differently. Old grudges suddenly seemed darker. That woman who muttered angrily last month, that man who refused to share firewood, that quarrelsome family across the field, couldn't they be in league with the devil? As the children's fits grew worse, so did the fear. The parsonage became a gathering place for speculation and suspicion. Paris himself, already insecure and defensive, leaned into the idea that his family was under spiritual attack. If his own home could be targeted, then the whole village was at risk. That message spread quickly. People began to murmur not just about witches, but about a larger battle being waged in their midst. The long winter dragged on. Snowstorms trapped families inside. Nights stretched endlessly. And through it all, the cries of afflicted children echoed in the minds of Salem's villagers. It wasn't just a cold season anymore. It was the beginning of something no one could control. The harshness of that winter mattered. Without it, perhaps the fears would not have taken such firm root. Perhaps hunger, cold, and sickness softened people's judgment just enough that suspicion felt natural, even necessary. In the dark heart of winter, with survival in question, the thought of witches didn't seem absurd, it seemed inevitable. When spring finally inched closer, Salem was already trembling. What had begun as strange behavior in two children had cracked open the door to terror. And with the snow melting and fields needing to be planted, the people of Salem would carry into the new season more than just the weariness of winter. They carried whispers of the devil, whispers that were about to turn into accusations. The strange behavior of Betty Paris and Abigail Williams could no longer be brushed aside as childish antics. Day after day, their afflictions grew worse, until the entire household and, indeed, the whole village was consumed by talk of it. The girls would suddenly scream as if struck by an unseen hand. They convulsed so violently that strong adults struggled to hold them still. At times, they barked like animals or spoke in eerie, broken phrases that seemed to come from nowhere. Sometimes they fell to the floor rigid, their eyes rolling back, their limbs twisted into unnatural shapes. For parents and neighbors raised to see Satan lurking in every corner of the world, this was not the behavior of ordinary children. Doctors had been called, though medicine in Salem was more guesswork than science. Dr. William Griggs, who examined them, could find no natural cause for what he saw. No fever explained it, no injury accounted for the spasms, no known illness fit the symptoms. When he finally shook his head and declared that the girls must be under an evil hand, it was as though he had handed the community permission to believe the unthinkable. The verdict was not medical but spiritual. And that verdict traveled fast. Others in the village began to show similar symptoms, or at least to claim they did. And Putnam Jr., just 12 years old, started crying out that unseen forces tormented her. Mercy Lewis, another young girl in the village, soon followed. Before long, a cluster of girls and young women claimed to be afflicted, their fits echoing what had been seen in the parsonage. They screamed together, thrashed together, and pointed invisible fingers at the shadows. If it had been one child, perhaps it might have been dismissed. But when it spread, Salem's people took it as proof that something larger was at work. The afflicted described sensations that chilled their elders. They spoke of being pricked by pins, choked by invisible hands, and dragged from their beds by unseen figures. They claimed to see specters, ghostly forms of people in the village, standing by their bedside, urging them to sign the devil's book. They clawed at their throats as though something strangled them. They writhed on the floor, contorting into postures that seemed beyond human strength. To those who watched, it was terrifying theater, but theater they believed was no act. Ministers, parents, and neighbors crowded into the afflicted homes to witness these episodes. They prayed loudly, reading scripture over the girls as if to drive out demons. When the name of Jesus was spoken, the afflicted sometimes screamed louder, which only convinced the onlookers that something unholy recoiled at the sound. In such a world, where the supernatural was woven into every explanation, this became undeniable evidence. Satan was attacking Salem, and he was using witches as his instruments. What made it even more powerful was the age of the afflicted. Children and young women were considered innocent, unable to invent such horrors on their own. If they cried out that they saw specters, it must be true. Their bodies became vessels of proof, their cries a kind of testimony no court could ignore. And once they began naming names, the storm could not be stopped. Yet the afflicted girls were not merely victims in this drama. In a society where children were expected to be silent, obedient, and nearly invisible, these sudden outbursts gave them an extraordinary kind of power. Their words carried weight that few adults could challenge. Their performances drew entire crowds into their homes. In their agony, they found a voice and the village listened. Some historians suggest that this role gave them a strange, intoxicating authority in a world that usually ignored them. Whether they realized it consciously or not, their afflictions placed them at the very center of Salem's story. The timing mattered, too. Salem was on edge. Families carried bitter grudges, the winter had been long, and the frontier wars with native tribes had left people terrified of raids. Death and fear lingered in the air. When children began to act as though Satan himself had taken hold of them, the community didn't see coincidence. They saw confirmation. The devil was real, and he had come to Salem. The afflicted girls fed off each other, their fits often erupting together. The more attention they received, the more dramatic the episodes became. Neighbors crowded into small houses, craning their necks to see. Some prayed, others shouted in fear, and still others muttered names under their breath, wondering who among them had brought such horror. The drama of the fits became a kind of stage, with the audience gasping and trembling as each new affliction unfolded. And the whispers spread farther. If Betty Paris and Abigail Williams could be seized, then no one was safe. Parents looked uneasily at their own children, wondering if they would be next. Farmers eyed their neighbors warily, recalling every insult, every dispute, every odd glance. The line between ordinary quarrel and supernatural malice blurred until it vanished. In Salem's imagination, the devil's fingerprints could be seen everywhere. What began as strange afflictions in a few children had now become a communal obsession. The village didn't just pity the afflicted, they relied on them as guides to identify hidden witches. Their writhing bodies became instruments of justice. Their screams pointed toward guilt. And once the first names were spoken, Salem would cross the threshold into something it could never walk back from. The afflicted girls would cry out in the meeting house, interrupting sermons with their shrieks. They would collapse on the ground when certain villagers walked by, as though struck down by invisible lightning. They pointed and accused with trembling fingers, insisting that the specters of their neighbors tormented them at night. Each accusation gathered momentum. Each fit confirmed what people already believed, that the devil was here, moving among them in familiar faces. For the villagers, there was no time to waste. Souls were at stake. God's wrath could fall on the entire community if they failed to root out the witches. The afflicted weren't just sick, they were warnings. Through them, God was showing Salem who its enemies were. And so the stage was set for the next fateful step, the naming of names. The news spread faster than the cold wind that rattled the shutters at night. The minister's daughter and niece were seized by something unseen, something that made their bodies thrash and their voices cry out with words too dreadful to repeat. By now, it wasn't just the Paris household living under the shadow of fear. The whole village was leaning in, watching, listening, whispering. Every lane and farmyard seemed to hum with the same question: what is happening in Salem? Neighbors began drifting to the parsonage in clusters. Curiosity pulled them, but so did dread. They crowded into the small rooms, their breath misting in the winter air, and stood in silence as Betty or Abigail collapsed in sudden shrieks. A woman might press her hand to her chest. A man might mutter a prayer under his breath. Children peered around their parents' skirts, wide-eyed. The parsonage became less a home than a theater of the uncanny, where the curtains were always drawn back for whoever dared witness. And the girls did not stop. They clawed at their throats, screamed names that faded into gasps, rolled their eyes until only the whites showed. When a prayer was spoken, they convulsed. When scripture was read, they covered their ears and wailed. People exchanged glances. Wasn't this proof enough? Hadn't they heard ministers for years warn that the devil would infiltrate even the most godly homes? And here it was, unfolding before their very eyes. Word of these strange displays reached the farms farther out, carried by riders, travelers, and the whispering mouths of neighbors. Salem Village was never truly quiet, but now every conversation bent toward the same subject. At wells, women muttered about it as they hauled buckets of icy water. At taverns, men leaned close to repeat what they'd heard, that the girls had named certain figures who appeared in ghostly form to torment them at night. At the meeting house, the subject buzzed even louder, though some ministers cautioned that the devil's power lay not only in bewitching children, but in sowing division. Still, warnings did little to slow the tide. The spectacle of the afflicted drew more attention with each passing day, and the audience grew larger. People who had rarely set foot in the parsonage now came to see with their own eyes. And once they had seen, most left shaken. Some were convinced beyond doubt, others hesitated, but they hesitated in silence. To speak openly against the idea of witchcraft was to risk suspicion yourself. What made it more dangerous was that the afflicted seemed to react to particular villagers. If someone entered the room and Betty suddenly shrieked, it was taken as a sign. If Abigail contorted violently in the presence of a neighbor, whispers thickened around that person before the night was out. It hardly mattered if there was proof. In Salem's way of thinking, the afflicted were the proof. Their bodies testified in ways that no argument could dismantle. And so, people began to watch one another more carefully. That widow who had quarreled last fall over firewood. That farmer whose cow had mysteriously died after a dispute with a neighbor. That woman who muttered to herself walking down the lane. Every oddity became suspect. Every grudge found new meaning. The lines of division in the village, already deep, now widened into chasms. As the weeks passed, Salem became less like a quiet farming settlement and more like a village under siege, except the enemy wasn't outside the palisade, it was within. The people were hungry for answers, for names, for someone to blame. And though no official accusations had yet been made, the crowd that gathered around the afflicted knew it was only a matter of time. The devil was in New England. The devil was in Salem. The only question left was, through whom? The villagers had seen sickness before. Fevers, agues, wasting illnesses that stole away children in the night. These were cruel, but familiar enemies. What the Paris girls suffered, however, baffled even the most seasoned mothers and fathers. Their cries didn't follow the patterns of ordinary pain. Their fits weren't eased by rest, by food, or by prayer alone. And so Reverend Paris called for a physician, hoping, perhaps, that an earthly explanation might settle the unrest gathering in his home. Dr. William Griggs answered the summons. He was no stranger to the ailments of the frontier, where limited remedies and rough cures were the best anyone could offer. When he entered the parsonage, he found the room thick with worry. Neighbors pressed against the walls, Paris pale and severe, and the girls in the throes of another fit. Betty whimpered and clutched at her throat as though strangled by invisible fingers. Abigail shrieked and convulsed, her small body jerking in spasms. The doctor bent to examine them, his hands hovering over their foreheads, his brow furrowed. He listened, he asked questions, he looked for fever, for rashes, for wounds that might explain such torment. And yet, nothing fit. No sickness, he knew, matched what he saw. There were no swollen glands, no signs of infection, no injury to explain the violence of their thrashing. The fits came and went suddenly, as if triggered by unseen hands. He could only shake his head. And then, after a pause that seemed to hang in the air like a tolling bell, he uttered words that rippled outward. This was not the work of nature, but of an evil hand. With that diagnosis, or rather, with that confession of helplessness, the matter left the realm of medicine and entered the realm of spirits. The people gathered in the parsonage stiffened. Some gasped. Others nodded grimly. A doctor, a learned man, had declared it beyond the reach of ordinary remedies. If science could not explain it, then surely scripture must. The news spread with startling speed. A physician had seen the girls, and even he could find no cure. It was witchcraft, had to be. In a world without modern explanations, the leap felt natural. For generations they had been taught that Satan preyed on the godly, that witches consorted with him to bring ruin upon communities. And now the proof lay before them in the writhing bodies of children. This moment mattered, perhaps more than any other. A respected authority had pronounced the afflictions unnatural. That gave the whispers in Salem the weight of truth. If it had remained the gossip of anxious neighbors, perhaps it would have died down. But with the doctor's words, suspicion solidified. Neighbors who had doubted now fell silent. Parents warned their children to pray more fervently. Ministers reminded their congregations that vigilance against the devil was their duty. And for Betty and Abigail, the attention only intensified. Every new fit drew more spectators, who saw in each contortion fresh evidence of invisible torment. Every cry for help, every scream of pain, seemed to demand an answer. Who had done this to them? Who was hurting the minister's daughter and niece? Soon the afflicted began to speak more clearly, hinting at names, describing figures that visited them in the night, whispering in their ears, pressing them to sign the devil's book. Salem no longer wondered whether witchcraft was present. It wondered who the witches were. And in that turn of thought, in that desperate search for culprits, the village's fate was sealed. It didn't take long for the afflicted to move from shrieks and fits to something more specific. Their torment, they insisted, wasn't just from vague, unseen forces, it came from particular people. The question that had been hanging in the air, whispered over and over through whom, was about to be answered. And once the first names were spoken, Salem would never be the same. The girls claimed that in their visions they saw familiar faces bending over them, urging them to renounce God, pinching and striking them when no one else could see. At first, the names slipped out in fragments. One girl cried that it was a shadowy woman with dark hair, another that it was a crooked figure who came at night. Then, more boldly, they began to accuse Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, the enslaved woman in the Paris household. Each name carried a particular weight. Sarah Good was known in the village as a beggar, a woman who trudged from house to house with her pipe and her tattered clothes, muttering under her breath when people turned her away. She had a reputation for bitterness, for snapping at neighbors, for being difficult. If anyone fit the image of a witch, it was her. When the afflicted pointed their trembling fingers at Sarah Good, many nodded grimly. Of course, Sarah Osborne was another matter. Once a respectable woman, she had fallen into scandal years earlier when she defied the village's expectations. She lived apart from the meeting house, rarely attending services. She had quarreled with her family over inheritance, married her servant after her husband died, and drifted into isolation. To the Puritans, who valued conformity above almost anything, Osborne was a red flag. Her absence from the community marked her as suspect even before anyone accused her. When her name left the lips of the afflicted, it seemed confirmation of what many had long suspected. And then there was Tituba. She was not a free woman. She was not white. She came from the Caribbean, her origins wrapped in mystery to the villagers who saw her as foreign and strange. To children, she was a figure of fascination, someone who told stories unlike any others, perhaps tales that mixed folklore with half-forbidden games. To adults, she was a reminder of a world beyond their control. When the afflicted named her, the choice felt both shocking and inevitable. She lived under Paris's roof. If the devil had slipped into that household, perhaps it had been through her. The accusations spread quickly through the village. At the tavern, men leaned close and muttered that they'd always suspected Sarah Good. At Wells, Women told each other that they'd seen Sarah Osborne muttering alone in the fields. And in the parsonage, Paris himself fumed and prayed, convinced that Satan's agents had targeted his family directly. The girls' fits became even more theatrical as the names were spoken. When Sarah Good's name was mentioned, they convulsed violently, as though her spirit had struck them. When Tituba entered the room, they screamed and clawed at the air. To the onlookers, this was all the evidence they needed. Why would the afflicted react so strongly if these women weren't guilty? Fear thickened the air of Salem like smoke. Once the first fingers were pointed, everyone knew more would follow. And the danger was this: once suspicion attached itself to someone, it rarely let go. A woman with few friends, a man with quarrelsome neighbors, a family with a tarnished reputation, all were vulnerable. The village's balance tipped. No longer was it about strange afflictions or idle speculation. Now it was about identifying witches, rooting them out before they destroyed the entire community. And for the three women at the center of these first accusations, the days ahead would be merciless. When the magistrates questioned the accused women, the room was thick with anticipation. Villagers packed the chamber, leaning forward to hear every word. The afflicted girls were there too, gasping and shrieking whenever one of the accused shifted or spoke, as if invisible blows struck them with each syllable. Sarah Good denied the charges angrily. Sarah Osborne, weakened by illness, protested her innocence faintly. But it was Tituba who would turn the tide of the entire crisis. At first, Tituba denied the accusations, as anyone might when faced with the terrible charge of consorting with the devil. She insisted she loved God, that she prayed with the family, that she meant no harm. But the pressure bore down on her. Reverend Paris, her master, had already made it clear that her life was in his hands. The magistrates pushed, demanded, threatened. The girls screamed at her, falling into fits as if her very presence tormented them. Then, something shifted. Tituba began to speak differently. Instead of continuing to deny, she admitted, yes, she had been approached by the devil. Yes, she had seen a great black dog and a strange man who offered her gifts in exchange for service. Yes, she had been tempted. And yes, there were others. Not just her. Not just Sarah Good or Sarah Osborne. There were more witches in Salem, dozens perhaps, working together in a vast and terrible conspiracy. The room erupted. People gasped. Some shouted prayers. Others leaned closer, eyes wide with both horror and fascination. This wasn't just a case of one or two troublesome women. This was a full-scale invasion of Satan's agents into their godly village. Tituba described a book, the Devil's Book, in which witches signed their names in blood, pledging loyalty to their dark master. She said she had seen marks, figures, even animals tied to witchcraft. She spoke of flight, of secret gatherings, of unseen tormentors who plagued the children in their beds. For the magistrates, this testimony was gold. Here was confirmation from the accused herself that Salem was under siege. They pressed her for more, hungry for every detail. How many witches were there? Who else had signed the book? What plots were afoot? Tituba gave enough to terrify, but not enough to end the suspense. There were many, she insisted. But she could not or would not name them all. The effect was devastating. The villagers left that hearing convinced more than ever that Satan had a foothold in their midst. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were now painted in darker colors than ever. And Tituba, despite her confession, was strangely spared the rope for the time being, perhaps because she promised cooperation, perhaps because her story was too useful to silence. She had cracked open Salem's imagination, and once the Devil's Book had been invoked, there was no closing it. From that moment, the trials would never be small again. No longer was this about a pair of afflicted children and a handful of suspects. Now, the entire community was a hunting ground for witches, and everyone knew it. Every family feared that their name might be whispered next, that the afflicted might point their fingers at them. Tituba's confession spread like wildfire, and with it spread panic. What made it so powerful was how it tapped into what everyone already believed. Puritans had long heard sermons warning of the devil's contracts, of his bargains struck with the desperate and the wicked. The image of a book where sinners sign their names in blood fit perfectly into those stories. And now someone from their very village had confirmed it. The devil wasn't a rumor or a distant threat. He had agents here, walking the same muddy paths, sitting in the same meeting house, sharing bread at the same tables. The devil's book became more than just a piece of Tituba's tale. It became a symbol, the embodiment of fear. If there was a book with names in it, then anyone could be on its pages. That uncertainty, that terrifying sense that no one was safe, fueled the accusations that followed. Better to accuse than to be accused. Better to speak than to fall silent and risk suspicion. From then on, Salem would not be looking for one or two witches. It would be looking for an army. And the more it searched, the more it thought it found. The panic had grown too large for whispers and household hearings. By the spring of 1692, the accusations were multiplying faster than the village could contain them. More and more names tumbled from the lips of the afflicted girls, and with each new accusation came arrests, interrogations, and the need for something more formal than a handful of local magistrates. Ordinary courts, already burdened with disputes over land and debts, could not handle the swelling tide of witchcraft cases. And so, the colony turned to a new solution, a special tribunal empowered to deal with the devil's work. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to hear and determine. The name had a stern gravity to it, imported from English legal tradition, and it carried with it sweeping authority. Governor Sir William Phips, newly appointed by the Crown, established the court in May. He could hardly have predicted what it would unleash. The tribunal was to sit in Salem town, not far from the smaller, rural village where the first fits had begun. Its purpose was simple, at least on paper, to hear the accusations of witchcraft, to weigh the evidence, and to determine guilt or innocence. But in practice, the court became a stage on which fear and faith collided, and where the rules of evidence bent under the weight of panic. The judges were men of standing, respected, educated, and, most importantly, devout. Chief among them was William Stoughton, a stern magistrate whose zeal for rooting out witches would shape every decision the court made. Alongside him sat others of high repute, men who believed firmly in the invisible world and in their duty to protect the colony from Satan's plots. None doubted the reality of witchcraft. The only question in their minds was how to uncover it. The first sessions drew enormous crowds. Villagers left their fields untended to see the spectacle. Families packed into the chamber, craning to glimpse the accused, whispering to one another as the afflicted girls writhed and cried out. The court had the weight of authority, but it also had the drama of theater. Every scream, every gasp, every prayer added to the sense that something cosmic was at stake. From the start, the Court of Oyer and Terminer gave weight to the most dubious evidence, the testimony of the afflicted and the notion of spectral evidence. If a girl claimed that the specter or ghostly form of a villager tormented her at night, the judges listened closely. The reasoning was twisted but sincere. Satan, they argued, could not use the specter of an innocent person without that person's permission. Therefore, if a specter appeared, the accused must be guilty of giving themselves to the devil. By modern standards, it was nonsense. To the judges and the crowd, it was chilling proof. The trials took on a rhythm. The accused would be brought in, sometimes in chains. The afflicted would scream, collapse, or point accusing fingers, often in perfect unison. The judges would question sternly, pressing the accused to confess. If they denied, the girls' fits grew worse, convincing onlookers that the devil was resisting exposure. If they confessed, it only confirmed that witches were indeed at work. Either way, the court's course was set: more arrests, more accusations, more trials. The creation of the court marked a turning point. Before, Salem had been a village crisis, terrible but localized. With Oyer and Terminer, the crisis became an official arm of colonial government. It was no longer gossip or local quarrel, it was the law. Each verdict carried the force of the state, and each execution was now sanctioned not just by neighbors, but by the colony itself. That weight made the panic feel unstoppable, inevitable, like a wheel turning faster with every revolution. For the accused, there was little hope. Denials often made things worse, seen as stubborn resistance to God's truth. Confessions, though humiliating, sometimes spared lives for a time because confessed witches might be useful to name others. But even then, the shadow of the gallows loomed. The villagers watched all of this with a mix of fear and fascination. Some wept openly at the trials, convinced they were witnessing the devil's defeat. Others clenched their teeth, uneasy but afraid to speak. After all, to question the court was to question the fight against Satan himself. And who would dare risk that? The court of Oyer and Terminer had been created to restore order. Instead, it gave the panic a stage, a script, and a deadly authority. What had begun as whispers in a minister's house was now a matter of law, with gallows waiting on the edge of town. And before long, the first executions would show that Salem's nightmare had only just begun. In the crowded chamber of the court of Oyer and Terminer, truth itself began to change shape. No longer did guilt depend on witnesses who had seen a crime with their own eyes or on tangible proof like stolen goods or forged papers. Here, in Salem's Witch Trials, the most powerful evidence came from visions, spectral evidence, as it was called. Spectral evidence meant that the afflicted could point to the ghostly form of a person they claimed to see tormenting them. A girl might cry out that Sarah Good's specter pinched her in the night, or that Rebecca Nurse's apparition perched at the foot of her bed demanding she sign the devil's book. Even if the accused was asleep in their own home, surrounded by family who swore to it, the word of the afflicted carried more weight. After all, who could argue against what another person said they saw in their dreams or visions? The judges leaned heavily on this logic, and the reasoning went something like this. Satan could not take on the form of an innocent soul without that soul's permission. Therefore, if your specter appeared to harm someone, you must have given the devil leave to use your image. To deny it was to suggest the devil had more power than God, and that was a thought too dangerous for the court to entertain. Better to assume guilt than to imagine Satan could act independently. In practice, this meant that an accusation was nearly impossible to refute. If a girl shrieked and claimed you pinched her with invisible fingers, how could you prove otherwise? If she fell to the floor convulsing at the mere sight of you, the crowd needed no more persuasion. Every denial was twisted into resistance. Every protest of innocence was reimagined as stubborn pride. For many of the accused, the only way to save their lives was to confess to a crime they had never committed and name others to divert suspicion. Spectral evidence made the trials both riveting and horrifying. Spectators filled the gallery, leaning forward as the afflicted performed their agony. They screamed when an accused woman glanced in their direction. They clawed at the floorboards, insisting invisible creatures tormented them. To the crowd, these fits were not performances, but revelations. Each spasm confirmed what the ministers had preached for decades. Satan was alive in New England, and his agents wore familiar faces. Some people, quietly, had doubts. A few asked whether the devil might use innocent images to sow confusion, whether these visions might be tricks to destroy the godly. Even Increase Mather, a leading minister, would later argue against spectral evidence, warning that it was better 10 witches escape than one innocent person be condemned. But in the fever of the trials, such cautions were brushed aside. Salem was convinced it was fighting for its very soul. The judges and most of the ministers agreed. The afflicted girls spoke truth. This reliance on invisible testimony meant that no one was safe. Any quarrel, any suspicion, any odd look could be magnified into a spectral attack. Old grudges resurfaced in the form of ghostly accusations. If you had argued with your neighbor over a fence line, don't be surprised if her daughter soon claimed your specter tormented her. The afflicted, whether by fear, manipulation, or desperation, began naming more and more people. The courtroom became a theater where visions served as verdicts and dreams as death sentences. What's striking, looking back, is how natural it seemed at the time. In a world where the supernatural was woven into daily life, visions weren't dismissed as fantasy. They were accepted as evidence just as real as footprints in the mud. Ministers had long warned their congregations to watch for signs of Satan's hand. Now here were the signs, plain and terrible. But with every conviction based on spectral evidence, the trials lost something essential: reason, fairness, justice. What replaced it was hysteria, cloaked in the robes of the law. And once the first death sentence was handed down, the line between fear and bloodshed would vanish altogether. Salem had embraced a system where dreams could hang a neighbor, and, before long, the gallows would make those dreams permanent. June came, and with it, the breaking point. Rumors, visions, examinations, and confessions had filled the spring, but now the court was ready to prove its resolve. Salem would see its first execution for witchcraft, and once that step was taken, there would be no turning back. The woman chosen, or perhaps trapped, for this grim milestone was Bridget Bishop. She was no stranger to the courts. Years earlier, she had faced accusations of witchcraft, though nothing had come of it. People remembered her as quarrelsome, outspoken, and too fond of bright red clothing, an indulgence considered scandalous in a community that prized plainness and humility. She ran an ordinary, sometimes rowdy tavern, where laughter and games spilled out into the night. To the Puritans of Salem, who clung to sobriety and restraint, such behavior was suspicious at best and sinful at worst. When Bridget Bishop stood before the court, she denied the charges flatly. But the afflicted girls screamed and writhed at her presence, and witnesses stepped forward to recall every strange incident they could tie to her name: pigs dying, butter failing to churn, odd looks exchanged in passing. Spectral evidence sealed her fate. The court declared her guilty of witchcraft. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop was led to Gallows Hill, a barren rise just outside Salem town. The air was heavy, the crowd somber and restless. Men, women, and children gathered to watch, their breath hushed as she mounted the wooden platform. She protested her innocence to the very end, declaring before God that she was no witch. But the noose tightened all the same. With a push, the trap gave way and Bridget Bishop swung, Salem's first hanging in the frenzy that would follow. The crowd shifted uneasily. For some, it was justice, a clear victory in the war against Satan's agents. For others, it was unsettling. To watch a neighbor hang on little more than visions and whispers stirred a quiet dread. Yet none spoke their doubts aloud. The authority of the court, the thunder of ministers, and the shrieks of the afflicted drowned out hesitation. Bridget Bishop's death set the precedent. The gallows were real now, not just a threat whispered in taverns or muttered in sermons. Her execution made the trials irreversible. Once blood had been spilled, Salem was bound to continue. To stop now would be to admit that an innocent woman had died unjustly, and no judge, minister, or governor was willing to bear that guilt. In the weeks that followed, more executions were scheduled. Each new hanging drew larger crowds, fed the hysteria, and deepened the sense that Salem was under siege by a hidden army of witches. The first rope had opened the door, and through it rushed a flood of fear, suspicion, and death. Bridget Bishop was gone, but her shadow lingered. Her death whispered a warning across the village: if she could be hanged, anyone could. And that whisper turned quickly into a roar. Salem was now a place where old grudges, strange dreams, or the screams of children could end at the gallows. The first hanging was not just a punishment, it was an invitation for many more. Fear in Salem spread the way sparks leap from a fire into dry grass, quickly, unpredictably, and with a hunger that devours everything in its path. Bridget Bishop's execution had shown the village, and the wider colony, that the gallows were real, that the court was serious, and that the devil's hand could indeed be punished with death. If one witch could be found guilty and hanged, then surely there were others lurking in the shadows. People who had once only whispered in private now spoke more boldly. And those who feared becoming targets themselves often chose the safer path, accusing before they could be accused. The afflicted girls, now celebrated as instruments of God's revelation, only grew more confident. Their fits became more elaborate, their accusations more sweeping. In the courtroom, they wailed, contorted, and pointed, declaring that specters clawed at them from every corner. Onlookers trembled, convinced they were witnessing invisible battles between angels and demons. Each time the girls cried out, more names were added to the list of suspects. The circle of the accused widened, touching not just outcasts and beggars, but respected members of the community. Salem village itself began to fracture under the strain. Families eyed one another with suspicion. Old grudges, disputes over land, inheritance, or livestock found new life as accusations of witchcraft. If a neighbor's cow died mysteriously, if a child fell sick, if a harvest failed, the explanation was now ready at hand: witchcraft. People who might once have ignored such misfortunes or blamed them on chance now found it easier, even safer, to blame someone else. And when fear provides the excuse, ordinary resentments can take on deadly force. The trials spread beyond Salem village. Other towns in Massachusetts began reporting cases of affliction. Ministers sent letters warning of Satan's presence, urging vigilance. Accusations poured in from Ipswich, Andover, and Topsfield. What had begun in one small parsonage now threatened to consume the entire colony. The fear was not confined to the poor or the marginalized. No one was untouchable. Even pious church members, even people of wealth and reputation, found themselves dragged before the court. Inside the jails, cells filled to bursting. Men and women who had lived quietly for decades suddenly found themselves shackled, awaiting trial. Husbands were torn from wives, children from mothers. The afflicted insisted the devil's army was vast, and the court seemed determined to root out every last member. Each arrest sent ripples through the community, leaving families scrambling to tend farms, care for children, and pay mounting debts with one or more breadwinners behind bars. The ministers only deepened the frenzy. Some, like Cotton Mather, urged the court to press forward, framing the trials as a holy war against invisible enemies. To hesitate, he argued, was to risk God's wrath. Sermons thundered from pulpits, warning that the devil was cunning and his servants hidden in plain sight. To resist the court or to doubt the afflicted was dangerous. It meant aligning yourself, however unintentionally, with Satan's cause. And yet, doubt lingered in some corners. A few people muttered that the accusations were spreading too far, too fast, sweeping up the innocent along with the guilty. But to say so aloud was perilous. Questioning the girls risked becoming their next target. Questioning the judges risked being seen as opposing justice itself. And questioning the ministers risked your very soul. Fear had created a silence deeper than any prison cell. What made the panic so effective was how it blended the supernatural with the mundane. On one hand, people truly believed they were fighting Satan. On the other, they were also settling scores, protecting themselves, or seizing opportunities. If you had quarreled with a neighbor, accusing them of witchcraft could end the quarrel permanently. If you owed someone money, their arrest might erase the debt. If you feared your own eccentric behavior might bring suspicion, pointing at someone else could deflect it. Fear gave cover to motives both holy and petty, and no one dared pull apart which was which. By midsummer, the number of accused had swelled into the dozens, and the gallows were no longer a rare spectacle, but a recurring ritual. The community gathered again and again to watch as the condemned were led to Proctor's Ledge, praying for mercy even as they gasped at each denial of guilt. For every execution, the belief in witches hardened, not softened. Rather than satisfy the hunger for justice, each hanging only stoked it, convincing the crowd that if one witch had been caught, surely there were 10 more waiting. Fear does not fade on its own, it feeds itself. In Salem, it moved from house to house, farm to farm, turning ordinary people into informers, turning quarrels into death sentences. The village that had once been bound by survival and faith now tore itself apart, convinced that salvation required sacrifice. And in that sacrifice, the gallows creaked again and again. Some of the accused were too poor, too voiceless, or too broken to do anything but endure the tide that swept them into the court. But others, men and women with courage, with stubbornness, with faith that burned as fiercely as the accusations against them, tried to speak back. Their words, however, rarely carried the weight they hoped. In Salem, a denial was often twisted into evidence of guilt, and a confession, though it might buy time, was its own kind of death. Brought before the judges, many swore with trembling voices that they were innocent. They invoked the name of God, called on Scripture, and begged the court to see reason. Some wept openly, insisting they had lived pious lives, that they had no dealings with the devil. Others stood stiffly, refusing to bow, their pride mistaken for stubbornness, their defiance branded as proof. In a world where spectral evidence carried the force of law, innocence was a weak shield. If the afflicted girls screamed at the sight of you, writhing on the floor and clawing at their throats, your words meant little. A few, seeing no escape, confessed. These confessions were often dragged out under the weight of relentless questioning, fear, or the whispered promise of survival. And confessing did sometimes mean the rope was stayed, at least for a while. But it came at a cost. To confess meant not only admitting you had served Satan, but also naming others who supposedly stood beside you. Each confession became a seed of new accusations, sending more neighbors into the court's grasp. The chain grew longer with every link. The silence of some was perhaps the most haunting. There were those who would not confess to a lie even if it saved their lives. They stood accused, pressed by judges and ministers, yet refused to say words they believed would damn their souls. Their silence spoke louder than any denial, a last act of resistance against a system that demanded they surrender to falsehood. And in that silence, the court heard arrogance. They saw pride, the devil's hallmark, and sentenced accordingly. For the accused, every choice was a trap. To deny was to inflame the afflicted and convince the court of your wickedness. To confess was to stain your soul and betray your neighbors. To stay silent was to be condemned as obstinate and unrepentant. No matter the path, the gallows loomed at the end of it. And yet, through their denials, their confessions, and their silences, these men and women left behind voices that echo through history. They show us the human cost of hysteria, the courage of those who refuse to bend, the despair of those forced to speak lies to survive, and the quiet tragedy of those whose truth was never heard. Salem's trials were not just about accusations, they were about responses. Every accused person forced the community to decide what it believed, what it feared, and what it was willing to sacrifice in the name of righteousness. And as more stood before the court, the spectacle grew. Each testimony, each breakdown, each final word became fuel for the fire. The accused spoke, but in Salem, the louder voice was always fear. Martha Corey's name came as a shock to many in Salem. She was not a beggar like Sarah Good, not a recluse like Sarah Osborne, not a foreign outsider like Tituba. She was a full member of the Salem Church, a woman of middle age who lived respectably with her husband Giles. For years, she had been known as pious, diligent, and sharp-witted, sometimes too sharp for the liking of her neighbors. If even Martha Corey could be accused of witchcraft, then the net had truly spread over everyone. The charge against her carried a peculiar sting. Some whispered that she had doubted the afflicted girls' fits, muttering that they were putting on an act. In Salem's fevered atmosphere, skepticism was dangerous. To question the girls was to question the court, and to question the court was to risk being seen as the devil's ally. When the girls began to cry out that Martha Corey's specter tormented them, it was almost as if their accusations were aimed not only at her but at doubt itself. When Martha was brought before the judges, she did not behave as they expected. She refused to crumble or weep. Instead, she stood straight and declared with unwavering voice that she was innocent. She mocked the absurdity of the charges, insisted on her faith, and demanded the court see reason. Her defiance rang through the chamber. But rather than inspire confidence, it only deepened suspicion. To resist so strongly, the judges argued, must mean Satan had given her the strength to withstand examination. Her poise was not admired, it was condemned. The afflicted girls shrieked and fell into violent contortions at her words. They cried that her spirit was biting them, choking them, bending their limbs. Onlookers gasped as the girls collapsed dramatically, their bodies twisting in the straw. Every denial Martha gave only seemed to spark another fit. The judges watched, their minds made up long before she opened her mouth. Here was proof enough, they thought. Her steadfastness was the devil's disguise. Her husband Giles tried to support her at first, but even he wavered under the pressure. When neighbors whispered that Martha's reading of strange books at night hinted at secret pacts, the rumor grew legs. To own books beyond the Bible was suspicious. To read alone was dangerous. Literacy in women was often eyed askance in a culture that prized obedience above curiosity. Martha's sharp intelligence, once respected, now became one more nail in her coffin. Despite her courage, the verdict was inevitable. Martha Corey was found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to hang. To the villagers, her conviction sent shockwaves. If a woman so deeply embedded in the church, so outwardly godly, could be declared a witch, then no one was beyond suspicion. The line between sinner and saint had been erased. What Martha left behind was more than just her fate. Her defiance showed that not all would bow, that some would stand to the end with faith unbroken, even if their neighbors refused to see it. In her stubbornness lay a kind of quiet dignity, the refusal to let fear dictate her truth. The tragedy, of course, was that in Salem, dignity counted for nothing. What mattered were the cries of children, the visions of specters, and the iron certainty of men convinced they were fighting the devil himself. Her story rippled outward. Some saw in her trial a warning: if Martha Corey could fall, anyone could. Others saw it as confirmation that the devil was clever, targeting even the pious to undermine the church from within. Either way, her conviction deepened the hysteria, proving that the trials would not stop at the margins of society. The noose now threatened the very heart of Salem's faithful. The gallows became a part of Salem's rhythm, as much as the tolling of the meeting-house bell or the creak of wagon wheels on the village road. By midsummer, the townspeople knew the path well: the slow walk from the jail to the place of execution, the grim procession up Proctor's Ledge, that rocky outcrop overlooking the town where a rough scaffold stood waiting. It was not a hidden place. Executions were meant to be seen. They were warnings carved into memory, lessons driven home with rope and wood. On the day of a hanging, crowds gathered early. Farmers left their fields, mothers carried their children, elders hobbled with walking sticks. Some came out of morbid fascination, others out of duty, others because they believed their presence was part of the village's defense against Satan. The condemned were brought in carts, their wrists bound, their faces pale but often calm. Alongside them, ministers walked, urging repentance and prayer. The spectacle was both holy and horrific, framed as a triumph of godly justice even as the noose swung in the wind. One after another, those convicted of witchcraft mounted the platform. Sarah Good was among them, her body worn by poverty and suffering, but her voice sharp as ever. When urged to confess, she spat defiance instead, declaring to her accusers that if they killed her, God would give them blood to drink. Those were not the meek words of submission the ministers wanted. They were words that hung in the air like a curse, whispered about long after the rope tightened around her neck. Rebecca Nurse also walked that path. A woman in her 70s, frail and pious, she had been a full member of the Salem Church, admired for her devotion. Many had doubted her guilt, but the afflicted girl's screams drowned out hesitation. To see her climb the scaffold, supported by others, was to watch the community's own conscience falter. If she could be condemned, who could not? Some in the crowd wept openly, torn between faith in the court and faith in the woman they had long trusted. But the court's decision held sway, and Rebecca Nurse's body swung like all the others. Each execution etched fear deeper into the bones of Salem. Instead of quelling suspicion, the gallows inflamed it. If so many were guilty, surely many more remained hidden. The devil's army was vast, hadn't Tituba herself said so? Each hanging was framed as a victory, but each one also demanded another and another until the list of accused stretched longer than the court could manage. For the condemned, Proctor's Ledge was the end of the road. For the villagers, it was a stage. Children remembered the creak of the ropes, the way the bodies swayed against the sky. Adults whispered prayers and clutched one another's hands, relieved it was not their names that had been called. And always, the afflicted girls were present, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling as if the spirits of the dying still clawed at them. The gallows did more than punish, it reshaped the very air of Salem. Neighbors who once shared bread now avoided each other's eyes, fearful that one might name the other. Families prayed more fervently, searched their hearts for sins, and yet lived with the gnawing suspicion that repentance alone would not save them if the afflicted turned their gaze. The scaffold was both an ending and a beginning, the end for those who swung, and the beginning of wider panic for everyone who watched. By the time summer deepened, Proctor's Ledge had become a place of pilgrimage and dread. The ground there was hardened not just by the trampling of countless feet, but by the weight of fear pressing on the entire community. And though the bodies of the hanged were quickly cut down, carried away, the image of them remained, burned into memory, haunting those who had watched. Salem was learning that death, instead of ending suspicion, only fed it. The gallows did not silence the panic. It gave it a voice, loud and merciless, carried on the cries of the dying and the whispers of the living. The strangest power in Salem belonged not to the ministers, nor to the magistrates, nor even to the stern governor who authorized the court. It belonged to children. Girls who, in ordinary times, would have been expected to sit quietly, keep their heads bowed, and speak only when spoken to, suddenly held the colony in their grasp. Their cries and accusations carried more weight than the testimony of respected elders. Their fits could sway the course of a trial, tip the scales of life and death, and bring neighbors to the gallows. It was an inversion of Salem's natural order. In a world where children were taught to be silent and obedient, the afflicted girls were loud, disruptive, and impossible to ignore. They screamed in court, collapsed in dramatic seizures, and pointed trembling fingers at men and women who had lived in the community for decades. Judges leaned forward to hear their words. Ministers thundered that God was using the weak to shame the mighty. And the people listened. And Putnam Jr., barely 12 years old, became one of the most prolific accusers. Her vision stretched farther and farther, reaching into houses and families across Salem and beyond. Mercy Lewis, orphaned by frontier war, claimed nightly torments and spoke with the conviction of one who had suffered much. Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, and others joined in, their collective voices weaving a net of fear too tangled for anyone to escape. The youngest girls were often the most theatrical. They shrieked when an accused which looked at them, twisted their bodies as though invisible ropes bound them, mimed choking and pinching until the entire courtroom gasped. And each performance was taken not as exaggeration, but as holy evidence. The community convinced itself that children, being innocent, could not invent such horrors. If they said they saw witches, then witches there must be. The courtroom became a kind of stage where these children directed the play. Their fits erupted at key moments, steering the judges toward guilt. When an accused person denied the charges, the girls screamed louder, proving in the eyes of onlookers that denial was itself demonic resistance. When a suspect faltered, begging for mercy, the girls calmed, as though appeased. Their behavior became both script and verdict, their voices more decisive than any lawyer's argument. Not all adults were comfortable with this inversion. A few muttered quietly that children were fickle, that they played games, that they sought attention. Some even dared to suggest the girls were lying. But such doubts were quickly silenced. To accuse the afflicted of deceit was to accuse the court of blindness and the ministers of error. And worse, it risked drawing the girls' accusations upon yourself. The presence of children at the heart of the trials gave the hysteria an almost unstoppable momentum. To argue against them felt heartless. To question them felt dangerous. And so, their words swept aside reason, their screams drowned out doubt. In Salem, children were not just witnesses, they were the engine driving the panic forward, fueling the trials with each cry. What must it have felt like for them? Perhaps some believed deeply in their own visions, carried away by the fervor of the community. Others may have discovered, consciously or not, the intoxicating power of being heard, of controlling a room of judges and ministers. Still others may have been caught in the tide, swept along by fear, peer pressure, and the desperate desire not to be left behind. Whatever the mixture, the result was the same. A handful of children held Salem in terror. Their words hanged neighbors. Their fits filled jails. Their visions expanded until no one, no matter how devout, was safe from suspicion. And the adults, instead of restraining them, gave them authority. In a society built on order and obedience, it was the children who now dictated who lived and who died. Cotton Mather had been a looming presence in New England long before the first accusations in Salem. He was the son of Increase Mather, the colony's most respected minister, and he carried both the pride and the burden of that legacy. Brilliant, ambitious, endlessly energetic, Cotton Mather believed he had been chosen to guide Massachusetts in its spiritual battles. To him, the devil was not just an enemy lurking in distant lands, he was present, active, prowling through the streets of Boston, through the forests of the frontier, and now, as the trials unfolded, through the homes of Salem. Mather's sermons and writings had long dwelt on the dangers of witchcraft. In 1689, just a few years before the Salem crisis, he had published memorable providences relating to witchcrafts and possessions, a book recounting the strange afflictions of the Goodwin children in Boston. Those children, like the girls in Salem, had fallen into fits and claimed torment by invisible forces. Mather had personally observed them, prayed over them, and written an account that painted their suffering as proof of the devil's work in New England. His words spread widely, reinforcing the sense that witchcraft was not only real but pressing close. So when Salem erupted, it was no surprise that his voice carried into the trials. Though not a judge, Mather's reputation gave weight to his opinions. He encouraged the court to see itself as God's instrument, to root out evil with diligence, and to trust the afflicted as vessels through whom hidden truths were revealed. He framed the crisis as a holy war, not just for Salem, but for the survival of the colony's faith. To many, his stance gave legitimacy to the panic. If a man of Cotton Mather's stature, educated at Harvard and steeped in scripture, believed the afflicted girls, then how could ordinary villagers doubt? His words were repeated in sermons, cited by magistrates, and whispered in households as justification for the widening circle of accusations. But Mather's involvement was not without complexity. He was fascinated by the invisible world, by the possibility of unseen spirits shaping human affairs, yet he was also uneasy about relying too much on spectral evidence. Later, he would caution that visions alone should not be enough to convict, though in the fever of 1692, such cautions were often drowned out. Still, his writings fed the imagination of Salem, giving theological weight to what the villagers were already inclined to believe. For the accused, Mather's authority was devastating. His warnings about witches gave the trials a sheen of divine purpose. Those who protested their innocence faced not just the suspicion of neighbors, but the intellectual firepower of one of the colony's leading ministers. To defy the court was to defy not only law, but the spiritual wisdom of men like Mather, and few dared risk it. Cotton Mather's voice also shaped how the outside world saw Salem. As news spread, critics and supporters alike pointed to his writings to argue for or against the trials. He became a symbol of the learned, godly elite lending their sanction to the hysteria. And though he would later attempt to temper his role, insisting he had cautioned against excess, the fact remained, his words had given Salem fuel. In a village where children dictated justice with their fits, Cotton Mather provided the theological scaffolding. He told Salem that what it saw was real, that the devil's hand was active, and that to falter in judgment was to betray God. And so, while gallows creaked and jails overflowed, his shadow stretched over it all, one more reminder that Salem's tragedy was not just the work of frightened villagers, but of respected voices who believed themselves righteous. ChatGPT said, Increase Mather had spent his life balancing the fiery zeal of Puritan belief with the sobering weight of leadership. As the father of Cotton Mather and president of Harvard College, he was a figure of immense authority, respected not only for his learning, but for his steady hand in times of turmoil. Unlike his son, who leaned eagerly into tales of the invisible world, Increase approached Salem's crisis with caution. He did not deny that witchcraft was real, no Puritan minister would, but he worried deeply about how the evidence was being used. The trials had already claimed lives when Increase began to voice his concerns. Spectral evidence, he argued, was a dangerous foundation for justice. Could anyone truly know if Satan might borrow the image of an innocent person to deceive and destroy? To assume that every specter belonged to the guilty was to give the devil more power than God, and that was an idea Increase could not accept. If Satan could imitate even the faithful, then to condemn someone on spectral evidence alone was not righteousness, it was folly. His words, preserved in his later writings, carried a warning that cut against the fever-gripping Salem. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. This principle, now familiar to us as a cornerstone of justice, was radical in its moment. In a colony convinced it was fighting for its soul, to spare witches seemed reckless. But Increase saw the deeper danger, that in their zeal to defeat the devil, the people of Salem might damn themselves by shedding innocent blood. Still, his caution was not enough to stop the machinery already in motion. Cotton's fiery words carried more weight with the fearful, and the judges, already committed to their course, were reluctant to admit error. Increase spoke with authority, but his was a cooler, quieter voice, competing against the screams of afflicted children and the thunder of the gallows. There were those who listened, though. Some ministers, uneasy with the rapid spread of accusations, found courage in Increase Mather's skepticism. A few magistrates, though reluctant to act on it immediately, carried his warning in their minds. And in time, as the trials reached their peak and began to collapse under their own contradictions, it would be his logic that helped shift opinion. But in the summer of 1692, when fear burned brightest, his caution was almost drowned out. The tragedy was that his voice came too late, and with too little force, to save the first victims. The court still leaned heavily on visions and fits, still hanged men and women on testimony that would never stand by any modern standard. Yet Increase Mather's warning planted a seed of doubt, a seed that would later grow into regret and remorse when the panic finally ebbed. In Salem's darkest days, he was one of the few to suggest restraint, one of the few to remind the colony that justice demanded care, that fear could not be allowed to dictate the gallows. His words did not stop the executions, but they echoed long after, a reminder that, even in hysteria, there were voices that saw the danger, not only in witches, but in the court itself. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old when Salem's panic pulled her name into its snare. She was frail, hard of hearing, and respected by nearly everyone who knew her. A full member of the Salem Church, a woman admired for her piety and quiet strength, she seemed the least likely candidate for witchcraft. And that was exactly why her accusation hit the community like a thunderclap. If someone as devout as Rebecca Nurse could be accused, then no one, not the elderly, not the godly, not the long-trusted, was safe. The charge shocked even some of the afflicted at first. How could Rebecca Nurse, who had spent her life in prayer and service, possibly be in league with the devil? But when and Putnam Jr. and others began to cry out that her specter tormented them, the tide shifted. The courtroom filled with gasps as the girls collapsed, shrieking that Rebecca's ghostly form pinched and clawed at them. To those already convinced that the devil was cunning, the idea made grim sense. Wasn't it logical that Satan would hide behind a mask of holiness, using a seemingly saintly woman to deceive the godly? Rebecca was carried into court in a chair, too weak to stand for long, and faced her accusers with dignity. She denied the charges firmly, her voice quavering but steady in faith. Ministers pressed her to confess, but she would not. The afflicted thrashed violently at her words, their fits escalating as if invisible chains tightened around them. To the judges, this only confirmed their suspicion. Her presence alone seemed to summon torment. What gave her case particular weight was the reaction of her neighbors. 39 men and women signed a petition on her behalf, attesting to her good character and long record of faith. It was a bold move, for to defend an accused which was to risk suspicion yourself. But they did it anyway, a testament to the esteem she commanded. For a moment, it seemed as though reason might break through hysteria. Her first jury actually returned a verdict of not guilty. Relief rippled through the courtroom briefly. But almost at once, the afflicted cried out, falling into fits so dramatic that the judges reconsidered. Pressured by the spectacle, the jury was sent back to deliberate again. And this time, after hearing more testimony, they reversed themselves. Rebecca Nurse was declared guilty of witchcraft. The decision crushed many in Salem. Even some who had supported the trials began to waver. If Rebecca could be guilty, Then the line between innocence and guilt was meaningless. But the court pressed forward, unwilling to show weakness. In July, she was taken to the gallows alongside others condemned. Too frail to walk steadily, she leaned on her companions as she climbed the scaffold. Before the rope was placed around her neck, she declared her innocence one final time, committing her soul to God. And then the trap gave way. Her execution reverberated through Salem in ways no other had. To hang an elderly, devout, respected church member was to strip away any pretense that the trials spared the innocent. And yet, rather than end the hysteria, her death drove it deeper. Some whispered doubts, but most silenced them, fearing that to question the court was to risk the same fate. The judges defended their verdict fiercely, pointing to the afflicted's fits as proof beyond reason. Rebecca Nurse's trial became a symbol, both in her own time and in memory, of the terrible blindness of Salem's panic. She embodied everything the village claimed to value: piety, service, humility. And still, she swung from the gallows. In condemning her, Salem condemned itself, though it would take time for that truth to sink in. For the moment, the villagers walked home from the execution shaken, glancing at one another with unease, yet still too afraid to speak what many of them surely thought. If Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then the word had lost all meaning. John Proctor was not the sort of man to hold his tongue. A farmer in his 60s, broad-shouldered, sharp-tongued, and stubborn, he was known in Salem for speaking his mind even when it won him enemies. Where others muttered behind closed doors about the trials, Proctor said what he thought aloud: that the girls were lying, that the court was blinded by foolishness, and that innocent people were being destroyed by hysteria. His outspokenness was unusual, even reckless, in a place where doubt itself could become evidence of guilt. From the start, Proctor had mocked the afflicted. When Mary Warren, a servant in his own household, began to show signs of fits, he scoffed at her. He threatened to beat the nonsense out of her if she continued her act, declaring that the girls needed correction, not pity. His bluntness echoed beyond his farm, and soon people whispered that his disbelief reeked of sympathy for witches. By standing against the tide, he had placed himself in its path. It wasn't long before his name appeared in the girls' accusations. They cried that his specter pinched and tormented them, that he forced them to sign the devil's book, that he dragged their souls toward damnation. In the courtroom, their shrieks grew louder whenever he protested. Where others wept or faltered, Proctor thundered, demanding the court see through the lies. "We are only what we always were," he declared, "but now the devil's children are grown into accusers, and they will bring us all down." His words rang with fury, but to the judges they sounded like defiance, like the pride of a man guilty and unrepentant. Proctor's resistance only made his plight worse. He wrote petitions, urging neighbors to speak against the madness. He begged the magistrates to dismiss the spectral evidence, pointing out how impossible it was to defend against invisible accusations. He even challenged the integrity of the court itself, accusing the judges of believing children's tales over reason. These were dangerous stands, each one deepening the court's determination to silence him. When Proctor was condemned, he did not falter. He railed against the injustice, insisting on his innocence even as the rope waited. His wife, Elizabeth, pregnant at the time, was also accused but spared temporarily until she could give birth. Proctor faced the gallows with unshaken resolve. To those urging him to confess falsely to save his life, he refused. A lie, he declared, would damn his soul more surely than a rope. On the day of his execution in August 1692, he walked with others to Proctor's ledge. His presence towered, not just in stature but in spirit. Where some trembled, he stood steady, his voice carrying above the crowd. He prayed, he proclaimed his innocence, and he faced death without surrender. His final moments became legendary, a man choosing truth over survival, even when truth offered no earthly escape. For Salem, Proctor's stand cut both ways. To the fearful, it was proof of how deep Satan's pride could run, that a guilty man would go to his grave unrepentant. To others, quieter but growing in number, it stirred doubt. Could such conviction truly belong to a liar? Could such courage come from a servant of the devil? His death planted seeds of disquiet in a soil already cracking under the strain of bloodshed. John Proctor's voice carried beyond the scaffold. Long after his body was cut down, people remembered his fury, his petitions, his refusal to bow. In a time when fear silenced most, he had spoken. And though Salem ignored him then, history would remember him as one of the few who dared to stand against the storm, even when it swept him to the gallows. The jails of Essex County were never meant to hold so many people. They were crude buildings, stone walls, iron bars, straw on the floor, and they had been built for the occasional thief, debt dodger, or brawler pulled from a tavern fight. By the summer of 1692, they were overflowing with accused witches. Salem's panic had packed the cells with men and women of every sort: beggars, farmers, widows, merchants, even respected church members. What united them was not their guilt, but the weight of suspicion pressed upon them by the court and the shrieks of the afflicted. Conditions inside were brutal. Prisoners were shackled in heavy irons, not because they posed real danger, but because the court insisted that witches could slip their chains unless bound with extraordinary care. The fetters chafed skin raw, left bruises on ankles and wrists, and made even the simplest movement painful. The air in the cells was thick with sweat, sickness, and the stench of waste. Straw that was meant to serve as bedding quickly rotted, infested with lice. Food was scarce, sometimes little more than crusts of bread or bowls of thin gruel, and families of the accused were often forced to pay jailers to provide even that. The prisoners were crammed together with little privacy. Old women lay beside young mothers. Farmers shared the space with widows and beggars. Infants wailed in the dark. Several women had been arrested while pregnant or nursing, and their children suffered beside them. Disease spread quickly in such conditions. Fevers burned through the cells, leaving the weak weaker still. For some, the jail itself became a death sentence, ending their lives before the court could. And yet, inside those walls, there was also resilience. Some prayed constantly, turning the dim, foul air into a sanctuary of whispered psalms. Others tried to keep spirits alive by sharing scraps of news from the outside world, rumors of who had been accused, who had confessed, who had swung at Proctor's ledge. A few even managed quiet acts of kindness, offering bits of food or helping neighbors stand when the irons bit too deeply. The most bitter cruelty was the demand for payment. Families of the accused had to pay for their loved ones' upkeep in jail. If they couldn't, debts mounted, leaving survivors ruined even if the prisoner was eventually freed. It meant that poverty pressed down hardest on those already suffering, and the stigma of witchcraft clung to families long after the trials ended. Some prisoners confessed under the weight of these conditions. Shackled, sick, hungry, terrified, they broke, telling magistrates what they wanted to hear in the hope of release. Others held fast, refusing to stain their names with lies, even if it meant death. The jail was more than a holding place. It was a crucible where human endurance was tested, where despair and faith collided in the dark. For the villagers outside, the sight of so many neighbors behind bars was both frightening and reassuring. It proved, they thought, that the devil's army was real and that the court was successfully rooting it out. But as the jails filled beyond capacity, a different unease began to stir. Could so many truly be guilty? Could Satan really command such a vast host in one small corner of New England? The questions were whispered, rarely shouted. For now, fear still drowned them out. The jails stood as silent witnesses to Salem's hysteria. Behind their walls, lives withered, families broke, and hope dimmed. The gallows claimed some, disease claimed others, and a few would emerge months later to face the world scarred but alive. For all, the memory of the iron shackles, the filth, the hunger, and the waiting never left. Giles Corey was an old man 80 years by most reckonings, stubborn as the rocky soil of his farm and just as unyielding. He had lived long enough to quarrel with half the village and make peace with few. He was not a man easily intimidated, and when the shadow of witchcraft fell across his family, Giles faced it in his own way, with silence, with defiance, and finally with a death so brutal it would haunt New England's memory for centuries. The accusations reached him through his wife, Martha Corey. When she was charged, Giles stood by her at first, but the pressure of the court and the venom of rumor soon ensnared him as well. Neighbors muttered about strange cattle deaths, about quarrels with Giles that had ended poorly for them, about his quick temper and sharp tongue. In Salem's atmosphere, those old grievances hardened into suspicion. Soon enough, Giles himself stood accused. Brought before the court, he refused to play by its rules. He would not enter a plea, neither guilty nor not guilty. To him, the proceedings were a sham, and he would not lend them legitimacy. But under English law, without a plea, the court could not proceed to trial. Salem's judges would not allow such defiance to block their path. They invoked an ancient punishment, rarely seen, peine forte et dure, strong and hard pain. The accused would be pressed with heavy stones until he either entered a plea or died. They took him to a field near the jail, stripped him to the waist, and laid him on the ground. A board was placed across his chest, and heavy stones were piled upon it. The weight drove the breath from his lungs, but Giles Corey refused to yield. Witnesses later remembered his words, not cries for mercy, but a simple, steady demand, more weight. Each time they added another stone, he answered with the same grim challenge. More weight. The pressing dragged on for days, each hour squeezing the life out of him, each moment testing the resolve of a man who had decided that silence was his last weapon. Some said he chose it to preserve his estate for his heirs, since a conviction would mean confiscation. Others believed it was sheer obstinacy, Giles Corey's refusal to bend even in the face of death. Whatever the reason, he held out until the stones crushed the breath from his body. His death shocked Salem. The gallows were grim enough, but pressing was another matter, an archaic punishment, gruesome and slow, carried out not in the structured ritual of an execution, but in the dirt of a field. Some onlookers were horrified, whispering that such cruelty dishonored the colony. Others muttered that it was fitting, that Giles's stubborn pride had brought him to it. But none could forget the sight, the old man pinned beneath boards, the sweat and strain of the men heaving stones, the rasping voice that answered only with more weight. In refusing to plead, Giles Corey denied the court its satisfaction. His silence forced them to condemn him without the ritual of a trial. His death became a kind of protest, a statement carved into the ground by his crushed body. He had refused to give them words, refused to give them legitimacy, refused to confess. And though Salem moved quickly on to more trials, his end lingered in memory, a dark reminder of just how far the panic had gone. The story of Giles Corey spread beyond Salem, becoming one of the most infamous tales of the witch trials. For those who later looked back in shame, his pressing symbolized the cruelty of the hysteria, the way law had twisted into torture, and fear into murder. In the quiet of that field, under the weight of stone, Giles Corey had given Salem one final lesson, that even the strongest courts could not crush a man who chose silence over submission. By the autumn of 1692, Salem was no longer the tight, if quarrelsome farming community it had once been. It was a place unraveling, its fabric frayed by fear, suspicion, and grief. The jails bulged with accused witches, the gallows had swung too often to be forgotten, and families that had once shared pews in the meeting house now looked at one another with narrowed eyes. Chaos had seeped into daily life. Fields lay untended as men and women who should have been harvesting stood accused or feared to leave their homes. Crops spoiled in the ground. Cattle wandered unfed or were sold in desperation to pay jail fees. The ordinary rhythm of life, plowing, sowing, reaping, was shattered by arrests, trials, and funerals. Salem, a community that had always lived on the edge of survival, now risked collapse. Households split under the strain. Some believed the afflicted, convinced the devil was everywhere, and urged the court to purge the land of witches. Others whispered doubts, troubled by the condemnation of respected neighbors. Families divided along these lines, brothers refusing to speak, wives quarreling with husbands, children turning against parents. In some homes, relatives even testified against one another, convinced that loyalty to God required betrayal of kin. The economic toll was severe. With so many accused, families had to scramble to pay debts, cover farm work, and provide for children left behind. Jails demanded fees for food and chains, livestock was sold, land mortgaged, possessions pawned. Even those not accused lived with the burden of higher taxes and the disruption of trade. Salem's prosperity, never rich to begin with, withered in the shadow of the trials. Fear warped social life as well. Neighbors no longer borrowed tools or shared meals freely. Every gesture was suspect. A sidelong glance, a muttered word, a quarrel long past, all could become evidence. Women avoided being alone with children lest they be accused of tormenting them. Men grew wary of speaking too boldly against the court. Silence, suspicion, and distance replaced the closeness that survival in such a harsh land had once required. Ministers thundered warnings, urging the people to stay vigilant, to repent of sins, to pray more fervently. Instead of calming the storm, their words often deepened it. The afflicted girls continued their performances in court and in homes, screaming that specters tormented them, naming ever more people. The list of the accused grew so long it seemed endless. From the poorest beggars to wealthy landowners, no one was beyond suspicion. Salem felt surrounded, besieged not by armies, but by an invisible enemy that could wear any face. And in the background, the war on the frontier with native tribes still smoldered. News of raids and killings drifted back to Salem, reminding villagers of violence beyond their own. Some whispered that the devil had a hand in those wars as well, that Salem's witches were allied with distant enemies. The panic expanded outward, connecting local tragedies to global battles in the Puritan imagination. Chaos was not only in the fields and homes, but in the very soul of the community. Salem had once believed itself a godly settlement, a beacon of purity in a wilderness of sin. Now it was a place where innocent women swung from the gallows, where old men were crushed beneath stones, where children dictated the fate of their elders. The irony was cruel. In its effort to purge Satan, Salem had become a place ruled by fear rather than faith, by suspicion rather than charity. Each new execution only deepened the confusion. Some villagers wept for the condemned, unable to reconcile their memories of kindness with the court's verdict of guilt. Others hardened their hearts, insisting that even the most unlikely person could be the devil's tool. The very idea of community, of trust, of shared faith collapsed. Salem had become a collection of frightened individuals, each guarding themselves, each wary of the next accusation. By the end of the summer, Salem was not simply in crisis. It was in chaos, a village undone by its own fears, its own courts, its own people. The nightmare had grown too large to ignore, yet too terrifying to stop. And as the autumn leaves fell, so too did Salem's faith in itself, crumbling under the weight of the hysteria it had unleashed. By late 1692, the frenzy that had once seemed unstoppable began, slowly, to lose its grip. Salem was exhausted. Too many neighbors had been dragged in chains, too many bodies had swung from the gallows, too many respected names had been blackened by accusations. What had once felt like righteous zeal was beginning to taste like bitter excess. The tide, at last, was turning. The seeds of doubt had been planted earlier, though quietly. When Rebecca Nurse was condemned despite her reputation for piety, some villagers whispered that something had gone wrong. When Giles Corey was pressed to death, crushed under stones for refusing to plead, others muttered that such cruelty could not be godly. Each shocking case left cracks in the wall of certainty. But now those cracks began to widen. Part of the shift came from the sheer number of accused. At first, when outcasts like Sarah Good or quarrelsome figures like Bridget Bishop stood trial, it was easy for the community to believe. But as the accusations spread to church members, respected farmers, and even children, it became harder to accept. Could Satan truly command such an army? Could nearly every family in the region be tainted? Some began to wonder if the devil's greatest trick was not in hiding witches, but in deceiving the court into killing innocents. Another turning point came with the behavior of the afflicted girls themselves. Their fits, once terrifying proof of torment, began to look less convincing to some eyes. The more dramatic the accusations grew, the more people whispered that the girls were enjoying their power. When they fell writhing in court, some villagers shifted uneasily, wondering whether these were genuine afflictions or theater. Doubt, once unthinkable, crept in. Ministers too began to diverge. While Cotton Mather continued to defend the trials, urging diligence against witches, Increase Mather's caution found more listeners. His insistence that it was better to let 10 guilty escape than to kill one innocent began to echo in sermons and conversations. Some magistrates, once eager to condemn, now hesitated. The gallows, which had once seemed like weapons against Satan, now looked suspiciously like tools of injustice. Governor Phipps himself, who had authorized the court of oyer and terminer, began to feel the pressure. Reports reached Boston of the chaos in Salem, of jails overflowing, farms failing, families ruined. Influential men, merchants, ministers, landowners, began to express alarm. If the trials continued unchecked, the colony itself might unravel. And then came the most shocking accusations of all. When the afflicted began to name people of wealth, power, and standing, men whose voices mattered in colonial politics, the panic struck too close to the core. If these leaders could be accused, then no one was safe. Suddenly, those in authority found themselves staring at the abyss they had helped open. To continue meant risking their own place. To stop meant admitting error. Slowly, reluctantly, they leaned toward restraint. In the village, the shift was felt in smaller ways. Neighbors who once flocked to the court began staying away. Families who had lost loved ones grew bitter, speaking more openly of injustice. Where once the meeting house had rung with fiery sermons about witches, now it carried quieter prayers for peace. The fear had not vanished, too many still trembled at the thought of Satan, but it was no longer strong enough to blind every eye. The tide did not turn all at once. Hangings still continued into the autumn. But the momentum was slowing. Each execution felt less like a triumph and more like a wound. Each new accusation was met with more hesitation, more whispered doubts. The court that had once thundered with certainty now wavered. By the close of the year, Salem was a community in uneasy transition. The storm had not ended, but the winds were shifting. Doubt was no longer a whisper, it was a murmur growing louder. And in that murmur lay the beginning of the trial's end. Salem had feasted on fear, but fear was losing its hold. The people were beginning, at last, to ask the question that had been forbidden for months: what if we are wrong? Governor William Phipps had returned to Massachusetts in triumph earlier that year, fresh from securing the colony's new charter from England. At first, he had allowed the court of oyer and terminer to proceed, trusting men like William Stoughton and influenced by ministers such as Cotton Mather. Witchcraft, after all, was a capital crime under colonial law, and Phipps had no reason at the start to doubt the zeal of his judges. But by the autumn of 1692, the crisis had grown so large, so poisonous, that even he could not ignore it. Reports flooded Boston about the chaos in Salem. The number of accused had swelled into the hundreds. Jails groaned with shackled prisoners. Crops were failing in the fields because too many farmers were imprisoned or consumed with trials. Families begged for mercy, petitioning the governor to intervene. Worse still, the accusations were creeping higher, ensnaring people of wealth and political importance. The net had stretched too far, and those in power felt the noose tightening around their own necks. The breaking point came when the afflicted began naming figures close to the governor's own circle. Even the wife of Governor Phipps himself was whispered about in the fits of the girls. It was one thing to condemn poor widows, quarrelsome neighbors, or eccentric farmers. It was another thing entirely to accuse the governor's household. The absurdity of it all was suddenly undeniable. If his own wife could be branded a witch, then the court had lost all restraint. Faced with this reality, Phipps acted. In October, he ordered the dissolution of the court of oyer and terminer. No more executions would proceed under its authority. In its place, he established a new court, one less willing to accept spectral evidence, one more cautious in its judgments. The machinery of hysteria had begun to grind to a halt. The decision was both a relief and a humiliation for Salem. Families of the accused rejoiced that perhaps their loved ones might yet be spared. Villagers whispered prayers of thanks that the nightmare might end. But for those who had driven the trials forward, judges, ministers, accusers, it was a blow to their authority. To dismantle the court was to admit, at least in part, that mistakes had been made. Yet no one wanted to say it aloud. Not yet. Governor Phipps framed his decision as a matter of order, not justice. He did not condemn the judges or the afflicted, but he made it clear that the colony could not survive more months of this madness. Massachusetts faced external threats from frontier war and needed stability, not endless trials consuming its resources. The court had become too destructive, too divisive, too dangerous to continue. The gallows grew quiet after his decree. No more bodies swung at Proctor's Ledge. No more carts carried prisoners through jeering crowds. The silence was strange, almost eerie, after months of shrieks and hangings. But it was also fragile. The prisoners still filled the jails. Families still carried the weight of stigma and loss. Salem was no longer in the throes of frenzy, but it was left raw, broken, and uncertain of how to heal. Governor Phipps's intervention marked the beginning of the end, but it did not erase the blood already spilled. The memory of the executions lingered. The sight of respected neighbors dangling from ropes haunted the villagers. And the knowledge that the colony's own leaders had once sanctioned such horrors hung over Massachusetts like a shadow. The panic had been stopped not by revelation, not by confession, but by politics. When the accusations climbed too high, threatening the powerful, the machinery was dismantled. For the ordinary people of Salem, it was a bitter truth. Only when the storm endangered the governor himself did the colony finally seek calm. When the court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved, the spell that had bound Salem began to break. It did not shatter all at once. Fear does not simply vanish when a governor lifts his pen, but the structure that had fueled the hysteria collapsed. Without the authority of that special tribunal, the accusations lost their sharpest teeth. The tide of panic that had carried the community from whispers to gallows began to ebb, leaving behind silence, shame, and the ruins of ordinary life. The prisoners still languished in the jails, chained and hungry, but their cases no longer raced toward execution. A new court was formed in early 1693 to take up the backlog, but its tone was different. Spectral evidence, once the cornerstone of Salem's justice, was now viewed with suspicion. Increase Mather's words, "Better that 10 witches escape than one innocent be condemned," echoed more loudly. Judges who had once leaned forward eagerly at the screams of the afflicted now hesitated. The afflicted girls still cried out, but their performances no longer held the same grip. The colony had grown weary of the theater. One by one, cases were dismissed. Juries returned verdicts of not guilty. Some accused were freed after months in chains. Others remained until debts were paid, grim proof that even innocence came at a cost. Families scraped together coins to settle jail fees before loved ones could walk free. For those who had confessed under duress, the release was bittersweet, their names forever stained. For those who had never bent, the relief was mingled with grief. Freedom gained too late to save those who had already swung at Proctor's Ledge. By spring, the executions had ended. The trials sputtered out not with a dramatic revelation, but with exhaustion. The colony had had enough. Too many had died. Too many fields had gone untended. Too much shame clung to the name of Salem. Even the afflicted themselves seemed to fade from the stage. Their power, once unassailable, waned as the community turned from them in embarrassment. The girls who had dictated the deaths of dozens now melted back into ordinary lives, carrying the weight of what they had done. Yet the damage lingered everywhere. Graves could not be emptied, debts could not be erased, reputations could not be restored. Families lived with empty chairs at their tables, with land sold off to pay for survival, with children who would never forget watching their parents dragged away. The trials had ended, but the aftermath had only begun. In Salem Village itself, life stumbled forward. Farmers returned to their fields, though many were ruined. The meeting house reopened for sermons, though it echoed with tension rather than unity. Neighbors crossed paths at wells and markets, but eyes no longer met easily. A wound had been cut across the community, and it would not heal quickly. The collapse of the trials did not bring celebration. There was no day when the village gathered to rejoice. Instead, there was a quiet retreat into normalcy, a desperate attempt to patch over the horror with chores, prayers, and the rhythms of survival. But under that surface, questions gnawed. How had they allowed it to go so far? How many innocent lives had they taken? And how could they ever make it right? The answer would not come quickly. Salem's nightmare had burned itself out, but the smoke lingered. And in that smoke, the people of Massachusetts would carry a heavy burden, the knowledge that the greatest enemy had not been the devil prowling the woods, but fear itself, devouring them from within. In the months and years after the gallows fell silent, Salem was left with something even harder to endure than fear: regret. The frenzy had ended, the trials collapsed, but the memory of what had been done pressed down like a stone on every conscience. Wives were widowed, children orphaned, farms ruined, and reputations destroyed. The village, once certain it had fought Satan, now had to face the truth that it had turned against its own. At first, few wanted to admit it. Ministers defended their choices, judges insisted they had acted rightly, and accusers slipped back into daily life as though their screams had not hanged neighbors. But silence could not erase the dead. The names of Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Martha Corey, and so many others lingered in conversations, in prayers, in the uneasy quiet of the meeting house. The accused had proclaimed their innocence to the very end, and now, with no new witches found, their words seemed less like lies and more like the truth Salem had ignored. Repentance began tentatively. In 1697, the Massachusetts General Court called for a day of fasting and soul-searching, a public acknowledgement that the colony had sinned in allowing the trials to spiral out of control. Villagers gathered in their meeting houses, not to accuse but to confess, to pray for forgiveness. Ministers preached sermons not of vigilance against witches, but of sorrow for the innocent bloodshed. It was a turning of the spiritual tide from righteous fury to shame. Some of the accusers themselves offered apologies. And Putnam Jr., one of the most vocal of the afflicted, stood in church years later and confessed that she had been deceived by Satan, that her words had brought about the deaths of innocents. Her admission was remarkable, but it did not undo the gallows. The families of the dead listened, wounded but powerless to change the past. For them, repentance was welcome, but never enough. Judges, too, wrestled with guilt. Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent, stood before his congregation and asked for public forgiveness. He bowed his head in shame as a minister read his confession aloud, acknowledging his error in condemning the innocent. It was a rare moment of humility in a world where pride had cost so many lives. Yet not all judges followed his path. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice, never repented, never admitted wrongdoing. His silence left a sour note, proof that, even after tragedy, pride could blind the soul. The colony took slow steps toward restitution. Some families of the executed were granted compensation, though the payments were small, unable to cover the cost of ruined farms or broken lives. Land lost to confiscation was restored in part, but reputations could not be so easily mended. A shadow clung to the descendants of the accused, a stain that apologies and coins could not wash away. For ordinary villagers, repentance was more private, more painful. Neighbors who had testified against neighbors lived side by side again, forced to share wells, fields, and pews with those they had helped condemn. The weight of shame hung heavy in every encounter. Children grew up remembering the hangings, carrying both grief for lost parents and bitterness toward those who had stood silent, or worse, who had pointed fingers. And yet, life demanded to go on. Fields had to be plowed, livestock tended, children raised. Salem did not vanish in its shame. It stumbled forward, scarred but still standing. Over time, the trials became a story, then a warning, then a legend told with sorrow rather than fury. Repentance softened into memory, regret hardened into history. But beneath it all lay the same haunting truth. The people of Salem had been their own undoing. They had listened to children's cries, to ministers' warnings, to the pounding of their own fear, and in doing so, they had spilled innocent blood. Their repentance could not raise the dead. Their regret could not erase the ropes that had creaked on Proctor's ledge. All they could do was bow their heads, confess their sin, and pray that God, if not history, would grant them mercy. The echoes of Salem did not stop at the village boundary. The panic had burned most fiercely in Salem Village and Salem Town, but its shadows spread across Massachusetts like smoke drifting on the wind. Other communities had seen their own citizens accused, their own neighbors hauled in chains to the jails. The executions, the pressing of Giles Corey, the spectacle of children dictating life and death, these were not local events, but colony-wide wounds. Massachusetts was already a place under strain. The colony had only just received its new charter from England, with royal oversight replacing much of the Puritans' earlier independence. Frontier war with native tribes still raged, draining lives and resources. Trade was fragile, crops uncertain. Against this backdrop, the witch trials made Massachusetts appear unstable, almost lawless, to outsiders. Reports carried back to England painted the colony as a place consumed by superstition, where courts abandoned reason and ministers stoked hysteria. The image was humiliating for a community that had once dreamed of being a city upon a hill, a model of godly order for the world. Within Massachusetts, the trials left behind bitterness and division. Families of the accused demanded justice. Some demanded compensation for property lost or lives ruined. Others demanded that the names of their loved ones be cleared from the stain of witchcraft. But there were still those who clung to the belief that the court had acted rightly, that witches had indeed walked among them. Old quarrels did not vanish with the end of the panic. They hardened, carried into the next generation. The authority of ministers suffered too. For decades, Puritan clergy had commanded near absolute respect. Their sermons guided not only faith but law and daily life. But after Salem, their role in fueling the hysteria became impossible to ignore. Cotton Mather, once admired, now carried the shadow of complicity. Increase Mather's caution earned him some credit, but even he could not escape the taint. The church, once the unchallenged heart of Massachusetts, now faced skepticism it had never known. The trials had cracked the bond between spiritual authority and civic trust. The government, too, carried the scar. Governor Phipps's intervention had stopped the bloodshed, but it also revealed how fragile colonial justice could be. Courts had abandoned evidence, relying on dreams and visions to condemn. The colony had watched as respected judges sent innocents to their deaths. That memory would not be easily erased. In time, Massachusetts would see reforms in its courts, a greater emphasis on evidence and procedure, but those reforms came only after lives were lost. Even in everyday life, the shadows lingered. Villages whispered about Salem whenever quarrels grew heated. Parents warned their children about the dangers of false accusations. Ministers preached sermons that referenced the trials as cautionary tales. The gallows, the jails, the shrieks of the afflicted girls, these became part of the colony's shared memory, shaping how people understood justice, fear, and faith. The tragedy of Salem was not confined to a single place or a single season. It cast doubt on the colony's claim to moral purity, it strained the authority of its leaders, and it left wounds in families and churches across Massachusetts. Long after the trials ended, long after the last prisoners walked free, the colony lived under their shadow, uneasy and haunted. Those who survived Salem's trials carried scars that never healed. Some were released from jail after months in irons, their bodies weakened by hunger, disease, and cold. They stumbled back to their homes, if homes still remained, only to find their farms overgrown, their livestock gone, their debts piled high. The chains had left marks on their wrists and ankles, but the heavier burden was invisible. The shame of accusation, the whispered doubts of neighbors who, even after the trials collapsed, could not entirely forget the taint of witchcraft. Children bore scars too. Sons and daughters who had watched their parents dragged away lived with the memory for the rest of their lives. Some had been forced to testify against their own mothers or fathers, repeating the words of the afflicted girls or parroting the suspicions of adults. Imagine the torment of a child who later realized their testimony had helped send a parent to the gallows. Those children grew into adults haunted by guilt, carrying the shadow of Salem in their hearts long after the village itself had tried to move on. Widows and widowers faced ruin. Without their partners, many families collapsed into poverty. Land was confiscated during imprisonment, debts mounted during trials, and reputations destroyed by the charge of witchcraft were not easily restored. Even when the government offered compensation years later, it could not bring back what was truly lost: trust, dignity, family. The apology of a court clerk or the coins of a restitution payment could not replace a husband, a wife, a child left swinging from the gallows. For those who confessed under duress, survival came with its own torment. They had saved themselves from the rope by lying, by claiming allegiance to Satan and naming others as witches. Some of them walked free eventually, but they carried the weight of betrayal. Neighbors remembered their confessions, and though most people understood they had been forced, the words could not be unsaid. Their names lived in the records, stained with guilt that was never truly theirs. The afflicted girls, too, bore scars, though of a different kind. When the trials ended and the community turned from hysteria to shame, the girls slipped back into obscurity. Some married and lived quietly, others moved away, but all carried the memory of what they had done. And Putnam Jr., years later, confessed publicly to her role, declaring that she had been misled by Satan. Her apology showed remorse, but it could not undo the dozens of deaths her words had helped cause. For others, silence became their only refuge. They never spoke of Salem again, as though burying their memories might keep them from devouring what remained of their lives. Even those never accused, never jailed, never directly touched still bore the scars. Salem was a small community, and everyone had lost someone, if not family, then a neighbor, a friend, a fellow church member. The trust that had once bound the village was shredded. Every handshake, every prayer shared in the meeting house carried an undercurrent of unease. Who had testified? Who had accused? Who had stayed silent while the rope tightened around the innocent? The survivors' scars were not just personal, they were communal. Salem as a whole had been marked. For decades afterward, the trials were remembered with shame, whispered about in taverns and meeting houses, referenced cautiously in sermons. No one could escape the stain. The trials had revealed something terrifying, that fear could turn neighbor against neighbor, that the bonds of faith and community could snap under pressure, and that once broken, they were nearly impossible to repair. Survival did not mean escape. For many, it meant carrying Salem inside them forever, chains that clinked long after they were struck off, ropes that tightened long after the gallows were empty, cries that echoed long after the afflicted girls fell silent. The voices of Salem did not vanish with the gallows. They lingered on scraps of paper, in court transcripts, in petitions scribbled by trembling hands, in the final words spoken beneath the noose. These voices, preserved almost by accident, became the most haunting legacy of the trials. Through them, we hear not only the fear and fury of 1692, but the humanity that refused to be silenced. Some voices came in petitions. Dozens of neighbors signed letters on behalf of the accused, pleading with the court to reconsider. They wrote of Rebecca Nurse's lifelong piety, of John Proctor's honesty, of the good character of men and women suddenly branded as witches. The petitions were dignified, respectful, couched in the careful language of a society wary of offending authority. But between the lines was desperation, the hope that words on a page might counter the screams of the afflicted girls. Most of these petitions were ignored. Still, their existence shows that not everyone was carried away by hysteria, that even in the storm there were those who tried to anchor Salem to reason. Others left behind testimony, recorded by clerks in the courtroom. These transcripts read like echoes from another world, men and women swearing they were innocent, praying aloud, asking their accusers to look them in the eye. "I am no witch," one would cry. "God knows I am innocent." The afflicted would shriek in reply, falling to the floor as though invisible hands seized them, and the judges would nod grimly. Reading those words centuries later, we can still hear the frustration, the futility of voices raised against a court deaf to everything but fear. And then there were the final words, spoken at the gallows, remembered by those who watched. Sarah Good, standing before the rope, refused to beg forgiveness. Instead, she turned on her accusers and spat out a prophecy: "God will give you blood to drink." Her defiance shocked the crowd, her curse ringing in their ears long after her body swung. Others, like Rebecca Nurse, whispered prayers to God, forgiving their executioners even as the noose was tightened. John Proctor spoke with fury, denouncing the injustice to the very end. These words, uttered in the last moments of life, carried a power no verdict could erase. Even Giles Corey, pressed to death beneath stones, left behind his terse, unforgettable voice. More weight, he demanded, again and again, until the breath left him. No sermon, no court record, no minister's justification could blot out those two words. They stand as a monument to defiance, a voice that refused to be crushed. What is remarkable is how these fragments endured. Many other voices in history have been lost, silenced by time or indifference. But Salem's were written down, carried forward, remembered. They became part of the colony's conscience. When Massachusetts later sought to repent, it was these words, petitions ignored, testimonies denied, last breaths spoken on the scaffold, that haunted lawmakers and ministers. They proved that Salem had not lacked truth, only the courage to hear it. Today, when we think of the witch trials, it is often these voices we recall. Not the cries of the afflicted girls, but the quiet insistence of the condemned: "I am innocent. God knows I am no witch." Those words echo louder than any verdict, louder than any sermon, louder even than the creak of the gallows. They remind us that, even in the grip of fear, people found the strength to speak, to pray, to resist. Salem's tragedy is written in blood and rope, but it is also written in ink and memory. The voices of the accused and the few who defended them carried across the centuries, shaping how the world remembers the trials, not as a triumph of justice, but as a warning etched in human words that refuse to die. The Salem trials might have ended with the gallows silent and the jails emptied, but their lessons did not fade with the smoke of 1692. They lingered, heavy and uncomfortable, shaping the way New England, and eventually America, understood justice, fear, and the fragility of community. Salem became more than a village name. It became a warning. The first lesson was about fear itself. In Salem, fear had been treated as evidence. The screams of children, the trembling of witnesses, the visions of specters, all had been accepted as truth because the community was afraid. Fear turned suspicion into certainty, rumor into testimony, and doubt into guilt. What Salem discovered too late was that fear is a poor judge, that when panic sits on the bench, justice is strangled by hysteria. Generations later, lawmakers, judges, and writers would return to Salem as the example of what happens when courts abandon reason for terror. The second lesson was about power. The trials showed how fragile authority can be when it feeds on fear. Ministers who had once commanded respect lost credibility when their words fueled the gallows. Judges who had worn the robes of justice were remembered instead as instruments of injustice. And children, who should have been powerless, seized the stage and bent a community to their cries. Salem revealed how quickly power can shift and how dangerous it becomes when those who hold it are neither checked nor questioned. The third lesson was about community. Salem had been built on the Puritan dream of unity, of neighbors bound together in godly purpose. Yet when the panic came, that unity shattered. Neighbors turned against neighbors, families testified against their own, and silence became complicity. The village discovered that bonds of faith and trust can snap in an instant when survival feels at stake. The scar of that betrayal never truly healed. Over time, historians, ministers, and politicians alike would look back at Salem and see in it a mirror. During later waves of fear, whether of religious heresy, foreign threats, or political enemies, the trials were invoked as a cautionary tale. "Remember Salem," people would say, when mobs demanded quick punishment, when courts flirted with dubious evidence, when fear threatened to outweigh justice. The memory of the nooses on Proctor's ledge became shorthand for the dangers of panic. Yet Salem also carried a quieter lesson, one drawn from the courage of the accused. Rebecca Nurse's prayers, John Proctor's thunderous stand, Giles Corey's defiant silence all showed that, even in the face of hysteria, truth could still be spoken. Their words lived longer than their deaths. They became part of the colony's conscience, reminding later generations that while fear may rule for a season, dignity and justice endure in memory. In the years after, Massachusetts tried to repent. Petitions for pardon were granted, small sums of restitution paid, public apologies issued. But the true lesson was not in coins or proclamations. It was in the way the trials reshaped New England's understanding of justice. The colony never again allowed spectral evidence to dominate its courts. The idea that it was better for guilty to escape than for innocents to be condemned began to take root more deeply. Salem's tragedy, though born of fear, nudged the colony toward the principles that would one day shape a broader American justice system. Salem became a word that carried weight. Not just the name of a town, but a symbol of how fragile justice can be and how dangerous it is when fear and faith are twisted into weapons. The trials were not forgotten. They were remembered, whispered about, written down, and carried forward as a lesson that still echoes centuries later. When fear rules the courtroom, innocence cannot survive. The story of Salem doesn't stay locked in 1692. It presses forward, a shadow cast across centuries, asking uncomfortable questions about fear, justice, and the human heart. Why does it still matter? Because Salem is not just about witches, it's about people and what people do when fear takes the reins. We carry Salem with us whenever societies look for scapegoats, whenever rumor outweighs truth, whenever the need for safety tramples the rights of the innocent. The villagers thought they were protecting themselves, defending their children, preserving their covenant with God. Instead, they destroyed their neighbors, broke their community, and left a stain that no amount of repentance could scrub away. It's a lesson that echoes whenever fear whispers louder than reason. Salem also teaches us about silence. Many saw the madness, but said nothing, afraid to be accused themselves. Their quiet helped the panic grow. It's a reminder that injustice thrives when good people hold their tongues, that silence in the face of hysteria is not neutrality but complicity. The condemned left us their words, "I am innocent, more weight," prayers whispered on the scaffold, but the silence of their neighbors weighs just as heavily. At the same time, Salem shows us the power of conscience. Rebecca Nurse's faith, John Proctor's refusal to lie, Giles Corey's defiance under the stones. These moments remind us that, even in hysteria, truth can survive. It may not save the body, but it leaves behind a legacy that outlives the gallows. Their voices, remembered centuries later, prove that integrity can echo louder than fear. And perhaps the most enduring lesson is humility. Salem's judges and ministers believed they were righteous, that they could not be wrong. Their certainty killed. The moment they stopped questioning themselves was the moment justice died. The warning is clear. Whenever we grow too certain, too convinced of our own virtue, we risk repeating Salem's mistake. True justice requires doubt, restraint, and the courage to say we might be wrong. Today, Salem is remembered not for the witches it never had, but for the neighbors it lost. The stones on Proctor's ledge, the records of testimony, the confessions wrung from the terrified, all remain as reminders. And they still ask us, how do we treat one another when fear takes hold? Do we choose suspicion or compassion? Silence or truth? Rope or mercy? The people of 1692 could not undo what they had done. But we can carry their story as a warning, a mirror, and a guide. Salem is not just history, it is a lesson written in blood and silence, a reminder that hysteria can rise anywhere, at any time, unless we guard against it. And that, perhaps, is the final legacy, that a small village, racked by fear and undone by its own hand, gave the world a story it cannot afford to forget. Salem's ghosts are not just in the past. They walk with us still, asking us to remember.